Welcome to the forum. Bienvenido al foro. Please take a moment to silence all your electronic devices and to locate all 4 exits from the auditorium. Assistive listening devices are available on request from one of the forum associates. Food and drink are not allowed in the auditorium, with the exception of water in covered containers. Restrooms are on the 2nd floor. Gender-inclusive restrooms are on the 3rd floor and lower level. If you need to leave the auditorium during the program, we recommend you exit through the rear doors at the top of the stairs. This event may be video recorded. Thank you. Tomen un momento para silenciar sus dispositivos electrónicos y localizar las 4 salidas del auditorio. Los dispositivos de asistencia auditiva están disponibles con uno de los asistentes del evento. No se permiten alimentos ni bebidas en el auditorio, con la excepción de agua en contenedores cubiertos. Los baños están en el 2º piso. Los baños con inclusión de género se encuentran en el 3er piso y en el nivel inferior. Si necesita salir del auditorio durante el programa, le recomendamos que salga por las puertas traseras en la parte superior de las escaleras. Este evento puede ser grabado en video. Gracias.
Can you hear me? Yeah, all right. Well, good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to all of you and everyone watching us online to the 2nd Annual Energy Opportunity Forum. Today's event is hosted by the Energy Opportunity Lab, an initiative at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia's School on International and Public Affairs. My name is Chandresa Krasnici. I'm a research associate here at the center, and it's my honor to be your host today. But without wasting any time, we'll begin the day. And I'll invite Jason Bordoff, the founding director of the Center on Global Energy Policy, to open the day with the welcome remarks. We will then start our conversations with a fireside chat with Andrew Herskovits, executive director of ODI Global Washington Leadership Team, to discuss accelerating energy for development in Africa. Off to you, Jason.
Thanks so much, Chandresa, and thanks to all of you for coming here today. Sorry for the slightly late start. Again, I'm Jason Bordoff, a professor of practice at the School of International Public Affairs, where I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy, and I'm really thrilled to be kicking off our 2nd Annual Energy Opportunity Lab Forum. The Energy Opportunity Lab is a really exciting initiative that we announced 2 years ago at COP27. And I'm really proud of what this program has accomplished over its first 2 years. The need for that kind of work has only become more evident over the last few years. To establish this program as one of the go-to voices on the development of policy solutions that are responsive to environmental and market needs that empower people and communities with sustainable and accessible energy solutions. Because you can't work in energy policy, as so many of us do, without acknowledging and prioritizing, hopefully, the prioritizing solutions to the profound inequality that exists within the global energy system. That's true all around the world, of course. Developing and emerging market countries account for 2/3 of the world's energy use. Last year, less than 1/5 of investment in clean energy goes into those markets. And the urgency of decarbonization, whether you're farming rice in Vietnam or laboring outdoors in Bangladesh or walking the streets of Phoenix, Arizona here in the United States, the urgency of decarbonization increases with the physical impacts of climate change we're already seeing. And developing countries, in many cases, continue to disproportionately bear the brunt of these harms, even though they are not responsible for most of the cumulative emissions to date. And I know we're going to hear a lot more about some of these sources of inequality today, such as per capita electricity consumption in the OECD being 50 times higher than in sub-Saharan Africa, still around 600 or 700 million people globally without any access to electricity at all. Nevertheless, the billions who need significantly more energy for prosperity, not just charging cell phones or powering light bulbs, but mechanizing agriculture, industry, having just a fraction of what so many of us take for granted every day. And this isn't just in the rest of the world. It's right here in our backyard in New York, as My colleague Diana Hernandez, who helps with Andrew to co-lead the Energy Opportunity Lab, noted in a recent report that in a typical year, more than 700,000 New Yorkers live in households where the utilities have been shut off at least once. So addressing these problems is urgent, and it isn't just necessary because it's the right thing to do, although it is also foundational to a clean energy transition, for the energy transition to be sustainable, to build support, to build buy-in, to have momentum. It needs to prove that it is going to be just and equitable and redress some of the wrongs that have characterized the energy system for over a century. And it's a historic opportunity. I wrote in the last issue with my frequent co-author, Megan O'Sullivan at Harvard in Foreign Affairs, about the historic opportunity created by the idea of taking the entire global energy system, how we power the entire world, and replacing most of that with different sources of energy, while hopefully bringing expanded energy use and access to billions of people around the world. This is one of the most monumental undertakings that we can conceive of, and doing it in a relatively short period of time, if we're successful by the standards of energy transitions of the past. So if we're going to do all that work to rebuild how we power the global economy, I think it would be a historic missed opportunity to not do it in a way that makes the system fairer and more just and spreads the benefits and harms more equally in the process. So that's why we're bringing together community leaders and practitioners and policymakers who are deploying innovative, sustainable energy solutions to address these issues, and why we're advancing dialogue on these complicated issues with our Energy Opportunity Lab at forums like the one today. Before we get started, I just want to quickly acknowledge again and thank the incredibly hard work of the team at the Energy Opportunity Lab for all the work they do and for putting this event together today. Fantastic team across the Center on Global Energy Policy and our communications office and our events team for coming together to put this together today at the end of what has already been an incredibly busy week, numerous events for all of us throughout Climate Week in New York. And really excited to kick the day off with my friend Andrew Herskovits, who has an exciting new job that he is going to tell us about as he sheds light on some of how we address some of the challenges that I just very, very briefly described, because he has spent a remarkable career in public service trying to address how we expand access to electricity, expand access to energy for development purposes all around the world. He's now the Chief Executive Officer of Mission 300 Accelerator, which is part of Rockefeller Catalytic Capital, which was established to help coordinate and support the efforts of many partners working together to advance the World Bank and the ADB's, African Development Bank's, ambitious commitment to help 300 million Africans gain access to electricity by 2030. He's one of the smartest people I know. He's forgotten more about these issues than I'll ever know, and I've learned a lot by talking to him and working with him over the years. So he really is a globally recognized leader and organization builder, most recently as the inaugural executive director for ODI Washington, one of the world's leading global affairs think tanks. So Andy, thanks for being with us today, and let's have a conversation. Welcome to Columbia. So tell us about your new job. What's Mission 300?
I have to start by saying I always laugh like when someone tries to tell me that I'm smart. I explain to them that, no, I just say what I'm thinking. And, and that's a lot of what people don't do. And you see this, to be effective, even on Mission 300, and I'll talk about what it is, but essentially it's the effort to get 300 million people access to electricity. You have to treat it as if you're like doing a renovation job in your house and you've got a contractor and you just want them to get the job done. And that's generally what the approach that I've taken with Power Africa, and everything that I do is just speaking up. And I'm shocked at how many meetings I've sat in over my career where people know that what's being said is just a bunch of double talk and it's not going to get anything done, and how few people actually speak up. I think it was my very first boss when I joined USAID back in 2001 who encouraged me, and all of us. He said, always take a seat at the table and speak up. You know, if you think something's like, there's a lot of smart people in the room, you're one of the smart people. And he said, you know, I was a lawyer then. He said, you know, in private practice when you're a lawyer, your client will tell you to be quiet when you start opining on how they run business. But he said in his 34 years with government, no one ever told him to be quiet. So.
What's an example of something like we hear all the time at conversations particularly on this issue, and you're like, all right, I know, but just let's stop talking about that and actually focus on what matters.
So development finance, right? The World Bank and the IFC, the operating model for development finance institutions is completely wrong. And you think about it, the way that development finance institutions are using public money to try to produce development results. And all they are development institutions that happen to use financing as a tool, the same way that USAID is a development institution that uses grants as a tool. But what's happened over the years is that development finance institutions, including the way that they're structured, have seen themselves as banks that are making money and trying to do good. Mm-hmm. That's what an impact investor does. That's what a private impact investor does. A development finance institution is designed to prioritize the outcome, the impact that you want to have. And then you figure out how you piece together all those public resources to leverage it in the best way possible, which might mean that you mix some grant money with some financing to keep interest rates low, because if your goal is to build a power project that's going to produce electricity at a low cost and drive economic growth in a country, it makes absolutely no sense to provide 20 years of financing in US dollars in a country where you know that the currency is going to depreciate about 90% against the US dollar over 20 years. Because what happens? You finance it in US dollars. They're charging for electricity in the local currency. As the dollar gets stronger and stronger, in order to service that debt, what do you have to do? You have to raise the cost of electricity. And electricity keeps getting higher and higher, and then you can't, politically, they don't raise the cost, and then the whole project goes belly up. You have to go into it realizing that the reason that these development institutions, whether it's a finance institution or a grant institution, is you're trying to help countries produce power at a reasonable cost. You have to take on some of that risk on the local currency. Not all of it, but you have to recognize that you're doing it to achieve a certain goal. Mm-hmm. So I say this again and again and again. And I think, I've written a lot about this as well. I think that's one of the reasons that they pulled me in to do this, is they know that I'll be honest with the World Bank and with everybody about what works and what doesn't work. So,
is that like a mindset shift, or the rule, or is it also about the charter and the rules and the permissions, like to do things like take on more currency exchange risk?
Yeah. So it's both. So it's a cultural change. It's a mindset change for the shareholders of these institutions. The U.S. government got it right and hasn't even realized it to the extent that it has. So I work for the Development Finance Corporation, which is the U.S. government's development finance institution that finances projects, oversees energy projects, port projects, small businesses, all these things. It used to be called OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. OPIC had to earn enough money to maintain its own operation. So it had to structure deals in a way that it can continue to operate. It didn't have the luxury of not earning a return. Okay? When Congress created Development Finance Corporation, mm-hmm. they removed that requirement. Instead, they said, we're going to give you, they're giving them about almost $1 billion a year. And you use that $1 billion a year to do deals that are going to benefit low-income and lower-middle-income countries.
That doesn't sound like a lot of money, by the way, compared to...
It's a tiny amount of money. Yeah. I'll tell you what, well, it's relative to. So it's a tiny amount of money for trying to something. And to counter China, basically. China, Russia.
This is like our Belt and Road.
It's meant to be our Belt and Road. So DFC has, and it said that they have to define what they view as their appropriate financial performance, which means they could say, we can structure a portfolio that only earns back 90 cents on the dollar, mm-hmm. and prioritize what those outcomes are going to be. So for example, they could say, we're going to finance this port project in a country, and we're going to throw a $50 million grant at it to make sure that a U.S. company or a friendly company, a U.S.-friendly company will manage that port to make sure it doesn't fall in the hands of China, if that's a priority for the U.S. government. Not a big deal, because $50 million is a drop in the bucket if there's going to be a massive conflict and a U.S. aircraft carrier can't get into that port, right? So these are all, it's a tremendously powerful tool, but I'm more concerned about the development side, although they're both important. And so we have this ability when it comes to energy access to really put our thumb on the scale and provide the type of financing that's needed. And that's what M300 is about. So it's the World Bank and the African Development Bank made this commitment for getting 300 million Africans access to electricity by 2030. But what's different about it is the World Bank has access to these resources called IDA, the International Development Association resources, and they're highly concessional, inexpensive capital that you can be used for low-cost loans and even a portion for grants.
Yeah.
And then you also have the International Monetary Fund has a trust that they created. It's called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. It was created during COVID, and it has billions of dollars in it that are meant to be able to help out with the climate agenda. And so there's about another $10 billion there that they're willing to access. So the bank already has identified close to $30 billion of resources that it wants to tap into to make this happen. It also has specific plans in countries for electrification, everything from grid densification to helping promote solar home systems. So it's taking an all of the above approach. African Development Bank has its pipeline. In total, there are about 120, 130 projects that we have in a pipeline. But you need to be able to grease the wheels on a lot of these things. So for example, in my first few weeks, Rockefeller Foundation, along with the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, we put $10 million into what we called a technical assistance accelerator. And the idea there was World Bank and African Development Bank processes are just too slow, and they know it. So we said, just tell us what you need to make your projects move more quickly. So we got 30 proposals came in from World Bank and African Development Bank, staff from all over Africa saying, we need technical assistance to help out with this. We need a consultant to help out with that. And so within weeks, we approved, I think, 15 of these projects already. We're moving on them. It's a bit unfortunate that we're using philanthropic capital to do this when the World Bank and African Development Bank sit on a lot of resources, but it's just the reality of trying to move quickly, and we're going to show others how we can move quickly. And to their credit, both of these institutions, from the top, they're busting through bureaucratic hurdles and processes and reducing timelines on things. So.
Just to close on DFC, because you mentioned it a minute ago, it's coming up for reauthorization next year. And I want to just comment on how big an opportunity that is, or there's a view I hear often here that it's never going to be like a tool that's fit for purpose. It's not up to the scale of the challenge. Yeah. Let's focus. Our friend Brian Deese wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs. Let's build a new clean energy finance authority.
Everybody wants to build something new. DFC's honestly, I was there for 4 years, and I complained about it a lot when I was there because I was trying to change the culture internally, and then and not complaining about the people. You don't need to change anything about it. It has the tools that it needs. I remember when we were running Power Africa, a senator would come up to me all the time and say, tell me what you need, tell me what you need. And I said, I've got everything I need.
I think it was
We've got
Coons.
the tools.
I'm guessing
that
it was
need.
Senator Coons.
Yeah. I'm like, we've got everything that we need in the US government. People need to be willing to use the tools. So I'll give you an example, all right? So when I was at ODI, just previously, a think tank, one of my colleagues did a deep dive into Sinosure, which is the Chinese insurance, risk insurance agency. Because I remember when we were running Power Africa, there was a period when very few of the projects we were supporting were moving forward, but these Chinese projects were moving forward. And I was like, what's going on there? Because everyone was on the sidelines because in Nigeria, because of this currency risk, they were expecting that they were going to float the currency, the Naira. And if that happened, it meant that suddenly those investments would quickly depreciate in value. So you'd be crazy doing it. But these Chinese projects kept moving forward, and everyone's like, oh, it's Sinosure. I'm like, what's Sinosure? It's this quiet little insurance agency that China uses for Belt and Road and for everything, and people pay like 7%, and it covers the currency risk on things. Like, oh, okay. So I get to ODI, and one of my colleagues has done all of this research going back at looking at Belt and Road for 10 years at the role of Sinosure. And I'm like, I saw it, I'm like, this is magic, what you've got here. So I wrote a piece with her on it, but essentially, Sinosure has a portfolio of about $1 trillion. That includes Chinese investment, but it's globally and a lot of overseas. Its margin of what it earns is like $100 million on a $1 trillion portfolio. So imagine what DFC could do if they raised the limit and they said, and already it doesn't have to earn a return. DFC could lose $1 billion and compete with them, but everyone's like afraid to do it. So there's so much more that we can do, but it's a mentality shift. A lot of the people who work in the development finance institutions, they come from the banking sector. So the idea of designing a project for financing that's going to only earn back 95 cents on the dollar, but you can predict that it's going to do that because you allocate some grant money to cover that other 5%. It's like anathema to them that they would do that. And so it's a cultural and mindset shift, but it needs to happen.
So not to go down the rabbit hole, but since we're a policy center, just to get like concrete on policy advice, because it is coming up for reauthorization, in addition to a mindset shift, what would you recommend?
What does DFC need?
I mean, is it about the scoring of equity investments, lending in local currency? Like, what does reauthorization need to do to strengthen this tool?
It just needs to reauthorize it. It literally needs to reauthorize it. The equity fix, everybody says, so look, equity is an important tool. And this is one of the things we're working on with M300 is we're working on, with the IFC on potentially creating a tool to make sure there's more equity investment in the energy access space. But I worry that people get so caught up on the equity piece that they just don't realize that good old vanilla loans get you a really long way as well. So yeah, there could be an equity fix or just keep giving them more money to make equity investments. It's how they use the equity, right? So like for me, when DFC got the authority to make equity investments, the idea was you had a lot of like African entrepreneurs out there who have difficulty getting access to loans because they don't have the equity that they need. So for a lot of people, we thought, all right, this is going to help a lot of entrepreneurs with $1 million, $2 million equity checks. And then that's going to open up things for them and build businesses. But they weren't doing that. Instead, it's like the same old, put $10 million into a fund with somebody who's based out of Singapore, who's going to be investing in a portfolio of projects that might be an eye care clinic and maybe movie theaters. And I'm like, is that moving the needle on development? I mean, sometimes it does. So they've gotten better. When I first got there, that's what it was like. Now DFC is really, their equity has gotten to be really good.
Just take this back up to sort of 30,000 foot level. I mean, DFC is one particular tool in a big toolkit. M300 is trying to bring together all of these actors in philanthropy and MDBs and government, but just like the theory of change and what you think is missing. We've made enormous progress expanding electricity access. Just very little of it has been in Africa, right? It's all been in Asia, in lower and emerging market, lower income and emerging market countries there. What just help us understand the landscape in Africa. Why is this so hard, and what are you focused on to change that?
Yeah, it's difficult for several reasons, and some that are external and some that are internal. So obviously the macroeconomic climate has changed significantly over the last few years with the cost of capital being so high. So when Power Africa was launched in 2013, cost of capital was really low and for the first few years, and then COVID hit. And now whenever, I mean, we all know this in this own room, like to get a loan, like how many people aren't either buying a house or a car or whatever because interest rates are just too high. Mm-hmm. Well, you take that and you triple it or quintuple it, that's the cost of capital in the countries that have the lowest electricity access because they tend to be countries with low credit ratings, so it's impossible to make those investments. So you've got that. Then you've got this issue of the people you're trying to reach are often the people who don't have the least ability to pay. These are the people who, they don't have electricity, they're in rural areas, sometimes they're the poorest people, so they're not good paying customers. Then you've got the issue of weak utilities. So most of the utilities in Africa are not profitable and basically on the verge of bankruptcy. But then you pile onto that the fact that a lot of them have deregulated and allowed private companies to produce their own power, which everyone thinks is a fantastic thing, and it's great, sure. Company can produce its own power, they're not reliant on the grid, they're gonna do, especially if it's a mining company, they're gonna start producing their own power from solar instead of using diesel generators, using grid power, great. Except for the fact that these are the best paying customers for the utilities. So now the utilities are losing their best paying customers, and they're expected to connect the people who have the least ability to pay to the grid as well. Then you have weak enabling environments in a lot of the countries where governments don't necessarily have the regulatory framework or the tax regimes in place to encourage the investment as well. So we're trying to, and then there's a lack of capacity.
Yeah.
When I say lack of capacity, and this
you mean like human talent?
So I said, yeah, it's human resources, human talent. You know, we were just talking about this. I remember when I was working with Power Africa, we were pushing Botswana and Namibia to scale solar in a significant way. These are two huge countries with low population density, with some of the best, solar resource potential in the world, who have the ability to interconnect to 8 other countries around them. Like, this is like the perfect place to do this. But they're countries with small populations, which means that their government budgets are small and the ministries are small. And then a year later, I saw that Namibia was getting all the support to develop clean hydrogen. So suddenly, everyone's focused on hydrogen. I turned to my successor in Power Africa, I'm like, what happened to solar? He goes, oh, it's the same guys who are focusing on solar, now the hydrogen guys. I'm like, literally they don't have enough people. Like, why don't we put people and embed people in those ministries? So sometimes it's just not having enough bodies, sometimes it's not having the right expertise. So one of the things that we want to work on with M300 is just that, having even just initially tiger teams that are focused on building local talent. We were just talking about this, like Kenya, for example. Kenya has an incredible amount of local talent, and it's been doing everything right with respect to renewable energy for the last decade or more even. And you just have to share some of that local talent and then build capacity. What I found is that when a country gets its first solar project across the finish line, everybody learns by doing, and then the next ones just kind of roll out. They become easier and easier and easier. So a large part of this is just building a talent pool locally in a lot of the countries. So we have to focus heavily on that. So we have access to inexpensive capital, local talent, building local talent, and then the other major, another major piece is political will and government buy-in. Yeah. So what often happens is you may have a great relationship with the Minister of Energy who says, or the rural electrification agency, we're going to do this deal. The Ministry of Finance says, I don't have any money for it. So you need from the top to get everybody aligned about what they're prioritizing. So one of the things that we're doing with M300 is there's going to be a heads of state summit in January in Tanzania with about 15 heads of state who are going to sign energy compacts, where the governments are commit to certain policy reforms, regulatory reforms. Others are going to commit to the resources that they're going to provide, but to make sure that everybody's fully aligned, and it has to be from the top to make sure that everybody agrees that this needs to move forward.
Can I ask you about the scale of the challenge you're undertaking, 300 million, and our climate goals? And so, again, these are big numbers, especially if it's not just access to electricity defined in a very small way, but it's enough energy for meaningful economic growth and prosperity. And there's often a sense that, and of course, we should skip the landlines for the cell phones and build distributed solar microgrids everywhere. But these are big numbers. Talk about how do we do that in a low carbon way? Is that necessarily the easiest and cheapest way? Is there a role for gas or even coal in how we meet that goal? Or is there a tension between these goals?
So a lot of people ask this, and it's important to remember, we're talking about the electricity getting to people's houses and to their businesses. It doesn't really matter, right? I'll give you an example. So most of the the electrical connections that will happen will probably be sourced through renewables, right? So even part of it is, if you think about Nigeria, Nigeria produces twice the amount of electricity from diesel gensets than they do from the grid, maybe even 3 times the amount. Part of what we're doing is helping actually get people off the diesel gensets and using solar batteries and things like that. So that's a play. But then you take a country like Sierra Leone, like DFC financed a gas power generation project in Sierra Leone, and people would say, and this is going to provide electricity to 1/4 of the people in the country. I'm like, no, it's not. It may generate enough power to do that, but you've got to get the electricity to people's houses. So it's one thing to just pump that amount of electricity into the grid, but if people don't have electrical connections, it's not doing anything. So of course, we're going to take advantage of whatever electricity is in the grid and get it to people if we can. But ideally, eventually, this will prime the pump for more and more renewable power generation. Look, there will be no energy transition globally without solving this energy access issue. And I say that globally because when you look at Africa's population growth, it's going to be the most highly populated continent with the largest, most highly populated cities in the world in Africa by the end of this century. And if you look at what's happening in Nigeria right now, if we don't solve that issue, that genset issue is going to happen all over the place, and everyone will just get the inexpensive, the least expensive like fuel or whatever they can do. So we have to solve the energy access issue. Why? Because we have to raise incomes. We need to make sure it's not just a single solar lantern or a single light bulb swinging in someone's house. It's got to be a productive level of electricity that's going to generate jobs and economic growth. Why? Because as people can afford more and as the cost of the cleaner technologies comes down more and more, you meet in the middle and you've got that transition. But if you've got over 1 billion people, because right now it's 700 million with population growth, if you don't do anything about it, it could be 1 billion. Billion people who are just like burning kerosene and burning wood, and it's an absolute climate disaster. And so this is why it's the #1 priority for the World Bank and African Development Bank right now. This is the issue you need to solve every other SDG. And this is why everyone's coming together. I was in at least 5 meetings with the president of the World Bank and African Development Bank this week, where all they were talking about was M300. So we went through this like, you probably remember this, back in 2013 was everybody was excited about Power Africa and everyone was announcing their energy initiatives. And then it got quiet for a while and people woke up again and said, we need to solve this issue. It's not just about the just transition. It's about the transition for everyone. We'll have a filthy planet if we don't solve energy access. And so we need to dive in now and make that happen.
So we have our team for the Energy Opportunity Lab and a lot of students working with us here. So I want to ask for advice. How can we help? How can we be, what's needed from institutions like this one that have knowledge, that have enthusiasm, that have a lot of human talent and capacity in the ecosystem that you sort of see coming together?
Yeah. So look, a couple of things. One, the margins on energy access are low. So everything that we can do to get down costs and figure out ways to do things better are going to make a huge difference. Lower cost financing. But then there's a company that I've been tracking closely. I literally mentioned them in every thing that I've done this week, just because I think it's really cool. And it's some young guys who started a company, and they're doing it's a waypoint. It's essentially like a mini grid, but it's basically like a containerized solar solution that they've got. Their third one now is in Djibouti, but what they've figured out is how to monetize every electron that comes out of that waypoint. They're not wired to anything, so what are they doing with that in this rural area in Djibouti? They're charging batteries that they then put into electric two-wheelers. And then those electric two-wheelers deliver batteries to people's houses, the same batteries, which people can then plug in, watch TV, light their houses, things like that. And that grew out of a blog that I wrote like a long time ago saying, wouldn't that be a cool idea? Check it out. And this guy started coming across that. But he's way smarter than I am. The other thing he's doing, they're also doing some water purification, making ice, have a little internet cafe. But here's where it gets cool. they've created a localized data center by using Starlink, where they're getting paid for like data storage and localized AI learning at like 10 cents a kilowatt hour or something like that. They're using the excess electrons for crypto miners who pay them, I think, between 2 and 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So they figured out how to monetize. And on top of that, they're getting like $20 a month from the Ministry of Education so that a teacher can have a license to use like the chat, the AI to do teaching. They're doing the same thing for a healthcare center. These guys are thinking through, how do you monetize everything that comes out of this mini grid so that it's actually sustainable and it's not just like some random solar panels with a couple of lines going to somebody's house who can't afford to pay for electricity. So they're figuring out ways to make this work from an economic standpoint. And there've got to be some really good brains in this room who are going to have like really cool business ideas like this. These guys, like, they're not turning a profit yet, but I'm like, I said to him, I'm like, is this kind of like an 8th grade science project, or do you actually see this making money? And he looked at me, smiled, he goes, our first 2 felt like that. He goes, no, we figured this out. We figured out how to scale this. He's like, I think we can make a lot of money on this. So usually I always bet on like the smart people and the entrepreneurs. Yeah. Like every successful entrepreneur I know, their business never ended up being what they started off with, but they quickly figure out how to make money and they solve these issues. So,
well, I see some of my students here and our global energy fellows, and there's a lot of pretty fantastic brains and future leaders here who hopefully can help you with that. We're at the end of an incredibly long and, for folks like you, exhausting week. So we really appreciate the work you're doing now with M300, and thanks for making time to be with us at Columbia this week.
Thanks so much. Good to see you.
Thank you, Jason and Andrew, for this very engaging discussion on advancing energy access in Africa and the critical strategies to achieve this mission. We're going to bring the conversation in a more specific context now, and for that I'm going to invite Dr. Vivek Shastri to moderate our first panel on energy for healthcare and livelihoods in refugee communities. I will also invite the panelists, starting with Ambassador Dr. Martin Kimani, Executive Director of NYU Center on International Cooperation, David Muzerski, President and Co-founder of Energy Peace Partners, and Dr. Juliana Ball, Assistant Professor at the Program on Forced Migration and Health at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. Over to you, Vivek.
Prevent everybody from landing in their borders and seeking asylum. All, it's
Sorry, I think my panelists are chatting in the green room, so let me get them. Hey folks, we're starting, come on in. Hi, Tony, how's it? Getting the band onto the stage. All right, excellent. Thank you, Chandresa, and welcome again, everyone. Welcome back to Columbia University, and welcome to this panel. And what a pleasure I have to moderate this conversation. And let me start off with some facts, right, about where we are today. So by the end of last year, globally, there were over 117 million people that were forcefully displaced from their homes, including 37 million refugees and 67 million internally displaced people. Just to put that number in context, that is equivalent to a third of the US population. Second, compared to a decade ago, there's been a threefold increase, 300% increase in the number of refugees and internally displaced people, and there's no sign of a slowdown. And forced migration is being exacerbated by climate threats, and that's what we're here to discuss today. The UN reported that in 2022, 84% of the refugees came from areas at a high risk of the threat of climate change. And it's estimated that by 2050, more than 1 billion people will live in countries that are unlikely to have the ability to mitigate and adapt to new ecological threats, creating conditions for mass migration. Right? And just finally, over 94% of the displaced people in camps today do not have access to electricity. And so access to reliable and affordable electricity is essential in humanitarian contexts, and not only to power homes, but also productive opportunities like livelihoods, local businesses, and health facilities. So I'm glad to have this panel today to sort of explore these issues, but also talk about what solutions are being explored on the ground. So let me start with you, Ambassador Kimani. Given this background, for over 2 decades, you've been deep in the crisis response and peace-building efforts. And so from your experience, what would you describe are the essential conditions for building lasting peace? And to what extent do access to reliable electricity and productive use livelihoods contribute to this process?
Oh, well, thank you. It's really great being back at the forum since last year. And thank you for the invitation. Well, first of all, I've not worked on peace and security issues for 20 years. I'm much younger than that. But for a long enough time. And I've been forced really to think a lot more about energy access and its relationship to peace building. So a lot of those statistics that you reflected are statistics of people who are mostly energy poor and who are trying to adapt by moving away from conflict, but also away from the inability to make a decent living and an inability to be part of a development story that, as everyone here knows, has energy at the heart of it. So from the bottom, there's the push of extreme weather events, many of them caused by climate change, that are exacerbating conflicts. And this is now quite measured, and I think we'll probably hear a lot more about that as the conversation goes along. And migration as a form of adaptation to climate change is happening. And the lack of energy means that those populations are unable to adapt where they are. They're unable to get the opportunities that they need where they are. So they've got to move. Then from the top down, every serious security strategy today has energy and climate change as part of what they've got to figure out. So whether you're talking about the US National Security Strategy, NATO's strategic outlooks, the United Nations looking at the Department of Peace Building and Political Affairs, the European Union, everybody is having to figure out the role of energy in assuring security. One, diversifying your energy mix. 2, lowering your exposure to volatile oil markets and also to oil exporting countries that are politically volatile. That's what China is doing with this huge surge of renewables. So at the end, energy sits right at the heart of the attempt to build peace and security. One quick final point, which I hope to elucidate further, is that we have to figure out how the financing and implementation of energy access can contribute to peace building in a much more linked way. How can that financing for energy become financing for peace building as well?
Thank you. And we'll talk more about financing as well. Let me come to you, Juliana, next. In your research, you've spent a substantial time among refugee communities in East Africa. And Martin talked about the energy piece. And when we look at the livelihood piece, what has been a general approach to livelihood development in refugee communities? And what variations, it's not a monolith, right? So what variations have you seen in how refugee communities perceive livelihoods and entrepreneurship?
I think this is a really good question because I think that, as a sector, as a humanitarian sector, we approach the idea of livelihoods from a deficit. So we look at, what do refugees need to be able to establish a livelihood? And we have this idea of livelihoods programming. And I say it starts from a deficit because we talk about, well, we have to conduct a needs assessment, a market analysis. But at the bottom of all that is what are refugees themselves doing? So the research that I find really interesting really goes to these settings and asks, well, how are refugees able to maintain a living? And we find that refugees are very busy already being entrepreneurs. So it's not that we need to train them to become tailors or to become shopkeepers. They are already doing that. So approaching refugees not as a deficit, but as an asset would mean that we would first of all understand what they're doing in Kakuma, what they're doing in Changwali, what they're doing in Kampala, and then try to understand how can we facilitate and support them to actually be able to conduct their businesses. Research shows that refugees are hiring other refugees. They're also hiring nationals, right? They're facing significant barriers to actually having and conducting businesses, etc., but they are overcoming them. So approaching refugees not as a deficit, but as an asset would mean that we would first of all understand their economic contribution. There's a really interesting paper that came out that looks at Kakuma as a marketplace. So trying to make a business case that investing in this camp, because there are actually already huge entrepreneurship opportunities in this refugee setting. And so making a business case to invest in Kakuma, and that is a completely different way of approaching refugees, not as a burden, but as an asset. And I think another reason that I think the idea of livelihoods programming is a little bit ironic is because you also have to think about integration. So, if I want to establish a business in Kenya, then I begin to sort of bump into the state. I need to register my business. I need to access financing, so banking services. I need certain pieces of paper to actually open a bank account. So we start to sort of, back into the state. And part of our work needs to, how do we advocate to ensure that refugees are able to access those services, register those businesses, have the paperwork to travel freely, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to ensure that refugees are able to have secure livelihoods, at the same time recognizing that they are already doing things to support themselves. They are transacting not just nationally, but internationally. So we've looked at Somali refugees in Uganda. They're importing things from Dubai. They're importing clothes from, et cetera, from other countries. It's not just a local enterprise. So I think there is an opportunity to really understand what refugees are doing, what their needs are, and as you've mentioned, really energy, right? You need to have a generator, et cetera. So it's all sort of, I think, very much integrated. Yep. And I think of it as one of those emerging issues that we need to invest a lot in trying to understand and trying to sort of build up.
Yeah, thank you. And I think there are a lot of conversations which try to figure out what are the energy needs for certain livelihoods and how do we power that. That's a technical solution. I think what we're trying to explore here is what are the livelihoods?
Yes.
What is the pathway over the next 5 or 10 years? What does that strategy look like? And as you rightly said, that also butts into what is the state's perspective on how refugees interact with communities that are already there. Dave, before I come to you, I want to go back to Martin for a minute. You've been a diplomat. You've been in the national government in Kenya for many years. Have you seen that strategy change over time in terms of how the state facilitates that interaction between the refugee communities and the host communities in terms of the businesses and the livelihoods?
I mean, I think there's been a sea change in Kenya's refugee policies.
Yep.
We started, during my time and as a security official, we had a primarily security interest in Dadaab especially. and we wanted it closed down. And that was because there had been, as you would expect from its location, a certain degree of Al-Shabaab interests. And these are trading networks, so there'd be some money and some individuals in there who were not we were looking for and trying to get out of our security space. But over time, that has changed now to more of a model of integrating refugees. I think we're at the beginning of a process where Kenya is going to pun intended, migrate from sort of encampments to integration with the rest of the population. And this is not going to be easy. This is not going to be easy. It's not going to be politically easy, but that's a direction of travel right now. And I think countries like Uganda have led there much more so. And Kenya is, I think, trying now to follow these footsteps of saying, okay, we need to stop securitizing refugees and start, I think, looking at them as people who need opportunities to integrate. But to invest, I don't think we're yet there. But that's where we're headed.
Right. Yeah, if you have to look at energy for livelihoods, there have to be livelihoods for that process. And I think it's this process of integration that really opens up the transactions.
But one of the things that I find so ironic is right-wing politics that are anti-immigration.
Yes.
In Europe, here in the United States, if a country like Kenya had those kinds of politics, we've had so many refugees, and there's never been a political backlash against having refugees. And that tells me either Africans are extraordinarily generous, or there's something in the West that needs to change, and it needs to change immediately, because the treatment of people who are forced to migrate by states in Europe, I think, as much as it's written in newspapers, receives far less attention. And as a Kenyan government official, I used to get delegations coming from those countries to tell us how we should be treating refugees in Kenya. But they themselves wanted nothing to do with it. Right. And yet, refugees are an international responsibility. Right. So the inequality of how African countries bear the greatest sort of financial cost of this, while the richest countries are doing everything to keep these people away from them, I think needs to be talked about more often.
Very true. Thank you. Dave, let me come to you now. In 2016, you founded a program that linked the three concepts that we are discussing today, which is conflict, climate change, and green development. I understand that you had spent many years in South Sudan and the Horn of Africa before that. So what led you to launch this program? And subsequently, tell us also about the Energy Peace Partners.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure and honor to be on this panel. I had spent 15 years prior to that in the conflict resolution and peace building space, working on the Sudan's, Horn of Africa, many years with International Crisis Group. I'd worked with the African Union panel on the Sudan-South Sudan separation, and firmly in the mediation negotiation world and space. And it was very difficult, but compared to today, that was a high point in international peacemaking. You had momentum, you had consensus relatively among the main international partners. Fast forward to today, I mean, even then, it was difficult. It was difficult, and one of the lessons that I realized was that it's somewhat formulaic. So the approaches of the peace and conflict actors, there's not a lot of innovation happening. There's not necessarily a lot of creative thinking. And climate change was starting to have visible impacts in conflicts in the region, beginning with Darfur, Somalia. The peace and conflict world, 10 years ago, was not thinking about climate change, wasn't talking, they weren't doing anything differently. It's starting to change. So the inspiration was to try to come at it from a new way. Climate change is having an impact. there's a lot of momentum and positive progress happening in the climate change space elsewhere in the world. Can you draw on some of that to support peace building? And what we realized, so I partnered with a climate scientist, a renewable energy expert at UC Berkeley to launch that program. And that led to the foundational work that became Energy Peace Partners. So what we realized was the most conflict-affected parts of the world also tend to be the least electrified, highly climate vulnerable, almost no climate finance reaches those. They're not priority countries because they're not large emitters. So for international climate finance, they're not priority countries. Just to put a number behind it, there's more than $500 billion a year invested in new renewable energy generation. About 6% of that goes to Africa and the Middle East combined, and very little of that reaches fragile states. So that was the motivating factor, or motivating thinking, and we tried to be very practical. So with Energy Peace, it's a mix of folks with peace and conflict backgrounds and renewable energy development, renewable energy finance. So we have done a couple things. One is we developed a financing mechanism called a Peace Renewable Energy Credit, which adapts an existing carbon accounting tool, a REC, renewable energy certificate, which corporations, it's a multi-billion-dollar market, corporations buy largely in the countries where they have large operations. So it's an important carbon accounting tool, sister mechanism to a carbon credit, that creates new revenue, supports projects in the parts of the world with large energy markets already. So we've worked to extend that to South Sudan, DRC, Somalia, Chad, northern Nigeria so far. Purchases by Microsoft, Google, Block, others. It's a way to try to channel sustainability investment to high impact first time electrification project. Second, we tried to leverage international programming and footprints. So UN peacekeeping, international humanitarian programming, overwhelmingly powered by diesel generators in settings without electricity access, without grids. So through a combination of policy research, we've been working on that. There's been some progress, but it's been quite slow. But like the impact of the size of these missions is astounding. In South Sudan, UNMISS represents 20% of all energy generated in the entire country.
It's through the UN and
just
humanitarian
through just the
operations.
UN peacekeeping mission, just their diesel generators.
20%.
In the whole country. In Central African Republic, MINUSCA is 40% in the whole country. So in theory, these missions represent unique entry points in places like South Sudan or CAR, where it's hard to mobilize investment. And there are many challenges to building a renewable energy project. If you can shift the way that these international mechanisms are powering themselves, you can use that to introduce renewable energy projects that then creates new opportunities for peace building, for development, for economic growth. So those are two areas of our work that we're working on.
Could I just say one thing? I think one of the reasons that you sort of see generators being the preferred energy driver is because we still at the humanitarian sector think of a very short-term approach to things. So to install solar power, to actually think of extending the grid, then that's a longer term approach. But to just buy a generator and use that and continue buying fuel, then it's that short term, we're not here to stay. So even that way of thinking needs to change for us to transition to thinking of these refugee camps and settings as protracted settings, crisis settings, not short term settings.
And the financing mechanisms for these institutions and operations reinforce that.
Exactly.
So it's 1 year finance.
Yes.
I mean, there's been a peacekeeping mission for 20 years almost in South Sudan now, funded on 1 year financing cycle.
And UNMISS before that with the 1S.
Exactly, with one. So since 2005.
Yes.
But they have a budget for 1 year. And humanitarians, sometimes a little bit more flexibility, but similar problem. Yeah.
There's great opportunity if the national authorities can do it. There's a new appetite to start developing national peace building strategies. And I think in the Summit of the Future this last week, one of the items on the pact is the issue of peace building and national peace building strategies. There's an opportunity to put energy access as part of a national peace building strategy. One, the blended finance that goes into renewable energy projects can take a more overt interest in the peace-building aspects, which also secures those assets when the communities surrounding the project are more peaceful. There's more peace building going on there. They have more opportunity from the energy, and perhaps the peace building work, which right now is small NGOs all pursuing little bits of donor money, can change significantly by allowing peace building and energy to be renewable energy financing to be better linked. It's a big opportunity, I think. And even when you see this big project, like the United States is pursuing the Lobito corridor, the Chinese have their own corridor strategies. We need to overlay those energy and infrastructure plays with peace building plays, so that peace becomes, we think of it as a public good, from which energy investors, governments, communities, everyone draws on this public good. But it's right now not being funded pretty much by anyone. If you go to a typical peace-building NGO in South Sudan or in Kenya, it's paid for by Denmark or donors who actually are starting to pay less and less and give less and less. So there's a chance here to transform how financing for peace can go. And I think the way to do it is through linking it to investments in energy and infrastructure.
Very interesting. So just to put some of those threads together, you have to think about a longer term integrated strategy that also includes infrastructure investments, particularly in energy, and integrate that into a peace building process so the two really like fall together. Dave, before I move, could you give some examples of where some of the peace renewable energy credits, the PRECs, have been deployed? What has it funded? One, and how have you dealt with some of the credibility issues that have popped up around the carbon market in the recent past?
Yeah, so we operate as a country issuer under something called the International REC standard, so International Renewable Energy Certificate. So basically, you have developed REC markets in North America and Europe, and outside of those two regions, the international system is this international REC system. And what we found was when we started this work, there were only 3 countries in Africa that were connected to this. It's a virtual mechanism, right? But it's the same mechanism that corporations use all over the world for their sustainability purchases. So we, serving as the issuer, it's in sort of stepping in for the role of the utility that would exist here in the US, for example. So we work with local renewable energy project developers to identify projects, qualify projects, do all the due diligence, and then on the other side, trying to connect this to corporate buyers. And so the first purchase was in Eastern DRC in 2020. Microsoft bought the first peace RECs from a Congolese solar mini-grid company, and it funded public street lights in addition, the mini-grid itself was already financed. It funded public street lights in a neighborhood that only had 3% electrification. There have been multiple purchases from DRC, Microsoft and Google and Block, 2 from South Sudan that funded electrification of hospitals in Malakal and Bor, so 2 local public hospitals. Purchase from Somalia and Chad, which are both streetlight purchases, northern Nigeria. So streetlights, public hospital electrification, and then rural agricultural productive use hubs. That's the other kind of project thus far that has been financed. What we're trying to do now is stand up a larger financing facility called the PREC Aggregation Facility. Very briefly, the problem we want to solve is to help finance new projects, get new projects built. REC buyers typically purchase from projects that already exist. So we've had to create something new that will be able to pre-purchase 10 years of PRECs from projects that aren't yet financed to provide the capital up front, so, and help them to finance and build those projects. So I guess the good news is that we're seeing increasing corporate interest in this idea of using their sustainability budgets and tools to also advance social impact goals. It's still a relatively new idea, but there's growing interest. The bad news is that the rules of the game for carbon accounting, the greenhouse gas protocol in particular, for Scope 2 and Scope 2, reinforces this reinvestment in countries where you already are and discourages and disincentivizes corporates from investing where they don't necessarily have programs. So we're working with a coalition of other nonprofits to try to reform that system and incentivize corporates to invest in under-electrified and unelectrified regions.
Ambassador Kimani, you have a new role now as the Executive Director of NYU Center for International Cooperation. And one of your longstanding focus areas is humanitarian crisis and the humanitarian development peace nexus, but also on financing for peace building. You've talked about integrating infrastructure financing into the peace building process, but what do you think needs to change in terms of the strategy for financing when you think of multilateral and humanitarian organizations to integrate energy and livelihoods as a core of the peace building strategy?
Well, I'm very new. I'm recovering from public service. And those of you who've been in public service know what I mean. Those who are going into public service, you shall discover it for yourselves. One of the things I've learned is that there's a lot of really useful data in government that is underused. So we are researchers. When I look at the data that's available for us to do the research here in New York, let's say about Kenya, which I know the best, there's so much data sitting inside the Kenyan government that could be used to make really, really important changes. So that's number one. Number two is that, as friend Andrew actually mentioned this, a lot of times us governments write checks that other people have to cash, right? Especially our citizens and the businesses in our countries. So we've not done a good enough job to match the promises we are giving in terms of the energy transition compared to the actual realities that communities and our citizens are living under. So there's less research than is required to really create realistic, achievable energy transitions and just energy transitions, not just affordable, but also just ones. So the risk of us coming to the New Yorks, to the COPs, and saying this sort of really setting these ambitious targets, there's nothing wrong with ambition, but it has to be rooted in real data, real granular research, so that you have a chance to do it correctly. I think we're setting ourselves up a little bit. And so in this next phase, I hope to encourage a lot more research collaborations with, one, local organizations, but also with government, and to earn the trust of governments enough for them to let us into their data so that we're able to give better advice as a think tank. Mm-hmm. I think we do a good job now, but having been in government, I'm struck by really how much data you have in government and how little you have outside it.
Right. That is a good segue to what I was going to ask Juliana. Let us assume that a lot of the innovative financing mechanisms that are being deployed do come into play at scale. But do practitioners, building on what the ambassador said, do practitioners have a good baseline understanding of the current and future livelihood opportunities in refugee communities, which also, it's not just inside, but also takes into context their interaction with the host communities?
I would actually say no. I think there's a couple of researchers. Karen Jacobson has written a lot about refugee livelihoods, but it goes back to sort of what I'm saying, which is that, I come from a family of refugees, so refugee agency is very important for me. Like looking at this sector from the perspective of the people affected, not from the perspective of those responding to disasters. So I think centering people affected by fleeing conflict or natural disasters, etc., forces us to start to really understand what exactly they're doing on a day-to-day basis. There is not enough of that research, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. I think it is starting. So, when I talk about the piece on Kakuma as a marketplace, or research among the Rohingya in Bangladesh, or research in Uganda, We're starting to see that research really center refugees themselves and what they're doing to actually meet their day-to-day needs. But I would say there is not enough of that. I also think the response to livelihoods programming has focused on how can we train people on, balancing books, how can we train people to be tailors, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very much training. But maybe that's not the right approach, because people actually do already come with skills, or they get those skills as they're in the places that they're living. They're not at a deficit of skills. They're at a deficit of opportunity, whether it's energy, whether it's the barriers to work, whether it's market opportunities. Those are the barriers that we need to sort of reduce, not necessarily the training piece. The training piece is easy because you can report to your donor that I've trained X number of people. You don't have to then report and say, did they actually take that training and start a business or actually become profitable? You just stop at the training piece of it. So I would say we need more research into what is actually happening within these refugee camps, not just on livelihoods, in a broad array of areas. I think about Kakuma. If you think about, her family that was in Kakuma in the 90s, Kakuma in the 90s and Kakuma today is completely different. And a lot of that change has been driven by the refugee population in Kakuma. It has become a town because of the significant amount of staff that was happening within Kakuma. So understanding how that refugee camp progresses from when it was established to today, what factors actually led to the success of businessmen in Kakuma. There's a story in The Guardian of one refugee who got a green card, the diversity visa, and now he's sitting in Kakuma thinking, do I really want to go to the US? Like, I have a $1 million business here in Kakuma, my wholesaler. I have, I'm set. Do I really want to go? So there's these stories of people really being successful, and we need to understand how that actually comes into play, what factors come into play, what drives the success. With the work we're going to be doing, which is trying to understand energy needs for refugee livelihoods, that goes to the state. Like, how is the Kenyan government supporting these places that have been there for 30 years in terms of extending the grid to these areas, because it needs to happen. So I think there's a lot more work that is sort of sitting that needs to be done. And maybe some of that is already with the Kenyan government, I don't know, but there is a lot that still, I think, needs to be done.
Let me just jump on this, because in the green room, you told me something that I found really.
But it was supposed to be a secret.
Yeah, but not. I hadn't realized it. Is the strange thing that Kenya or other African countries, there are no strong research university departments on forced migration, for instance. So the knowledge is being generated outside about something primarily happening in Africa. So one of the things that makes me quite proud of the Center on International Cooperation is that we work with a think tank in the DRC called Ebuteli. We actually created it. So Congolese researchers came to New York and were working at CIC. And then we co-created a think tank now in Congo. So it's linked. So our Congo research group, the director of our Congo research group is a deputy director in the Ebuteli in DRC. And the reason for that think tank is not to export the data. Congo is a place of extraction. Rather, it's to generate knowledge for Congolese while we in New York support how we operate at the global level and especially at the UN. So this work of building the research that feeds the energy transition response to climate change, it's not enough to just send people and do really good research. We actually need to build research relationships with institutions in Africa, in the global south generally. And those are not easy to do because a lot of times the flow of money creates hierarchies of power. And I see it, and it's really difficult to push back. So if you're a sub-grantee to Columbia University or to an NYU institution, and you're sitting in Kinshasa or Nairobi, it's not easy. Right. So even how the money is done to build these partnerships, how we're able to partner with organizations on the ground, perhaps establish laboratories ourselves on the ground, that's going to be what gives us the sort of quality research that is in itself going to enable more investment. Right now, there's a lot of conversations and far too little investment because the data and the research case and the business case is not being made.
Great. We have 3 minutes, so let's close. Yes, please, go ahead.
Two quick additional points.
Actually, I was going to ask for 2 quick points from each.
Perfect, yeah.
On cue.
My work here is done. One is to say on the data gap, I think one of the things that we've learned in our work is that there is, specifically talking about energy access and renewable energy, there is no common framework and very little consistent evidence around the social impacts of energy. So connecting this idea to some of the livelihoods, other points that were made, there's a need to invest on the research side to be able to quantify and measure the other social impacts of energy access, because right now it doesn't get measured. So you're left with chasing after donor. If it's investors, if you're chasing after investment, they're looking at economic return and maybe carbon impact. But that's it. There's no way to value or measure the social impacts, including peace-building impacts, which can be significant. The second, just to flag, is the role of the private sector. So refugee settings have warped economic systems because you have donors and funders that provide short-term, sometimes longer-term funding. Private sector is key for all the local projects that local developers, renewable energy projects that we've seen, with one exception. It's private sector that is getting things done, and it's private sector. And we have found local entrepreneurs working in the hardest places trying to develop energy projects. And their biggest through line across all the places, multiple countries where we're working, biggest common challenge is access to financing. So just to flag importance of the role of private sector and the importance for a research perspective of better quantifying some of the social impacts of energy access to be able to unlock additional investment.
Perfect. Juliana, you get the last word.
No, Ambassador.
No. I'm good. I'm good. I'm done.
I think the point you made about the private sector becomes really important because the private sector a lot of time drives the innovation. They are motivated by profit, but it means that they are going to go to those hard-to-reach places to try to extract, profit or etc. So I think the public-private partnership, even within humanitarian settings, becomes really important. Refugee livelihoods are not happening within just the refugee camp. They're engaging with the host community. They're engaging with the private sector. They're engaging with the public sector. So ensuring that we are understanding the dynamics in these settings, understanding the dynamics from the social side of things, from the economic side of things, from the political economy side of things becomes really, really important and critical. And I really like the work that you're doing around peace building and energy, because I think also that is an area that I, for one, have not even thought about or focused on. So you're bringing in an element that I think is missing as well in humanitarian studies.
Great. Well, what a pleasure to have had this conversation. We've focused on, at the risk of oversimplifying the summary, integrating a lot of longer-term plans on energy infrastructure and financing into the peace-building process. We've talked about the importance of data and research and really localizing that research and have it anchored in the communities where these transitions are happening, and also bringing in the role of the private sector. Thank you all so much for engaging in this conversation, and look forward to working more with you in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll give them their time. Okay, all right. Thank you so much, the panelists, for this very important conversation on the role and the need for energy access to support the livelihoods and the well-being of displaced communities. Appropriately, they ended the conversation with the role of the private sector, and that is exactly what we'll be discussing in the next panel, more specifically, the role of the private sector leadership in the African energy transition. For that, I will invite Andrew Kamau, our Managing Director of International Programs at EOL, to moderate this panel. I also invite the following panelists: Sandao Giambo, the Assistant Secretary General and Executive Director of the UN Global Compact; Sepidi Moremong, the CEO of Africa 50; and Dr. Billy Pfizer, President and CEO of Resources for the Future. I understand that they're still getting, okay, perfect timing. Okay, over to you, Andrew.
Sit anywhere.
Thank you.
Boy, go.
Okay. Great.
Thank you very much. It's as if David knew we were going to speak about the private sector after his panel, and so he's given us a nice segue into the role of private sector in the energy transition, and more especially the private sector in Africa. And I have a distinguished panel, of course, who are going to try and explore some of the issues that we hear about a lot. So maybe I start off by giving you those boring statistics that you hear about all the time, about the state of the energy transition in Africa. So according to the IEA, the total investment of global energy investment last year surpassed $3 trillion worldwide. And as Jason said earlier on, only 3.7% of that was in Africa. Clean energy, of the $2 trillion that was expected to be invested globally in the clean energy technologies in 2024, Africa only received $40 billion, which is only 2% of global clean energy investments. As a proportion of GDP, Africa's annual energy investments is about 1.2%. And there's obviously insufficient amount of investment that is taking place. And sometimes, I always ask the people who are involved in trying to help us move forward with this, don't you feel depressed sometimes and wonder, why am I doing this? Is it so important? But I guess the future really is going to be in Africa, as we heard earlier on, with a population of 2 billion people by the turn of the century. And the strange thing about it is that China will only have 800 million people by then. So we need to take this thing quite seriously into what's going to happen. And I want to start off with Sepidi. Sepidi, by the way, welcome back to Columbia.
Thank you. It feels
it's always nice to have
back
alumni back. So for those students who are there, this is your future. This is what it looks like. Africa 50 is a pretty innovative organization. And not many people know what you do. People hear about African Development Bank, but Africa 50, what's the logic?
The logic is very simple.
Yeah.
Our African governments have struggled to execute on infrastructure projects on the continent. And so it came about looking for an instrument that's going to speed up and scale up implementation, right? I think the recognition is that our governments are not there to implement infrastructure projects. And so Africa 50 is owned by 32 African governments, the African Development Bank and 2 African central banks, with a view, obviously, of getting more African countries involved. But our role is really threefold. One, getting projects to bankability, right? The issue is always around there are not enough bankable projects on the continent, which is true. And then getting to mobilize capital, not just private sector capital, not just public sector capital, but private sector capital into infrastructure on the continent. So, you know, gray hairs trying to raise capital for infrastructure. But as you said earlier, Andrew, I mean, it's critical. If the future of Africa, if the future of the world is going to be Africa, there's going to be a crisis if we can't power and provide electricity and educate the youth on our continent. We talk about a youth dividend, but it could be a youth curse if we don't address the issues.
Yeah, I mean, that is, it's profound because as Ambassador Kimani once said in another discussion we're having with him, that these Africans are going to be prosperous, whether here in the US, in Europe, but they're going to be prosperous somewhere. Mm-hmm. So they might as well be prosperous at home. And this is why the discussion that we had in the past about migration is so important. I wanted to ask you, Sanda, yes. There's a whole issue about risk perception. And I guess the risk is a sovereign risk perception. But, you know, like the Global Compact, it was formed to have this discussion between private sector, because of course it was seen that there is a serious role between private sector and governments in the UN. But private sectors are the ones that bear the brunt, because they say that private sector cannot borrow at less money than the sovereign. You can never pierce the sovereign. Mm-hmm. Your organization, the Global Compact, has a lot of members around the world.
Right.
And a growing number of members in Africa. And one of your principles, these 10 principles that help credibility and transparency and all the things that are supposed to be risk mitigants. Can you just tell us a little bit about those principles and how your journey as the compact is helping bring this credibility?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for having me. And just to say, I mean, you've been a great partner with us in terms of our Africa Business Leaders Coalition, and we can talk about that later. But part of it actually answers that question, demonstrating that there is a strong, forward-looking, investable cadre of African businesses that can be there. First, I think, just to help de-risk, and also to, you know, what should I say, challenge the perception that the African private sector is not coming to the table, is not interested, does not invest in and of its own continent. But to your question about the Global Compact and our principles, so we're an organization that turns 25 next year, actually, but we have these 10 principles, as you said, on human rights, labor, the environment, and anti-corruption. And we believe that they're very foundational to the very essence of a sustainable, inclusive business. So we've worked to advance these principles. You know, they're probably the precursor to ESG, actually. You know, and incidentally, ESG was also born in the Global Compact. So we really saw the value of having principle-led business as an opportunity to define what good business looks like. We furthered it with the ESG narrative as well. But I think, you know, what really underpins it is that good business exists around the world. We're at 24,000 members now. Admittedly, we have a lot more to do on the African continent. But I think what our task is really to address the critical question of perceptions and the way that that is weighing down on the African private sector. You know, you talked a little bit about perceptions. Maybe we'll dive into a little bit more. And a little bit about being depressed around the statistics. I think for me, what depresses me the most is the dichotomy between what perceptions exist and what really happens on the ground. If you look at statistics, 6 of the 20th fastest growing economies this year are in Africa, and in countries that perhaps we wouldn't have thought of. It's not the usual suspects. It's places like Niger. It's places like Ethiopia. You know, I come from Kenya. Kenya's not on that list right now. But who wouldn't want to take a bet on investing in an economy with a fantastic ROI? But the perception clouds that. So we're trying to work with a set of businesses and build their foundation so that they are seen as investable, can attract the capital they need to attract, and can do the business that they need to do.
Early on, there was a discussion on the humanitarian side of it, which I thought was very strange, because I never thought about it, is the PPP between the UN, governments, and local entrepreneurs in humanitarian settings. William, your organization now is what, 50 years old?
70.
70 years old. You've not been there all this time, have you?
Yeah.
And one of the things that I find so interesting about what you guys do is the whole issue on the economy how do you set up these economic structures? And we in Africa have been talking about, PPPs. How do we get transmission lines going? And I'm going to talk to you about this, Savini, because you guys have been fantastic about this. But I find that this model, these economic models, they're not so prevalent within African governments. And what are the learnings? For example, recently Kenya and South Africa went into open access, where you can use the grid, you can use transmission, you can privatize transmission. But what are the things that we need to look to? What are the flaws that were, for example, here in the US when it started 34 years ago? And what are the things that we need to avoid? And what can organizations like yourselves help us think through some of these things?
That's a great question. I mean, first of all, our Resources for the Future, it's 70 years old, and our basic, thesis is that important energy and environment questions benefit from independent research and public engagement. And so we've been doing that kind of research on these questions for 70 years. And one of the questions I think you're talking about is around the electricity sector and the design of electricity markets. And that's been, if you look at the history of the United States, we started with vertically integrated utilities. We went through a period where parts of the country were deregulated and broken up into transmission and generation and retail sales. And I think it's, and it stopped partly because it wasn't working in some parts of the country. And so if I try to think about the lessons, there are a lot of questions that have to get answered about how you set up markets so that everybody has access, that you still provide reliability to end users, that you incentivize all the different things that you need, like capacity and spinning reserves and all these ancillary services. And in some sense, I think the lesson is that you need to be pretty far along and have the markets really well developed in order to deregulate the markets. I was thinking about in advance of this, some of the challenges that I think you face in developing country contexts. And it's the institutions. I mean, even in the regulated vertical utilities in the United States, you have to have very sophisticated regulators who are different than the private utilities, setting rates, deciding what the resource planning looks like. It requires a lot of expertise in the government, and it requires a lot of expertise in the private sector. And I remember that was one of the things I think Andrew was talking about in the first panel was the need for more capacity, human capacity. And so I suspect that's one of the things that is a really important lesson to think about as you're moving into this development in Africa.
Yeah, but William, the thing is, you don't know what you don't know. This is the problem. So we've had utilities. You've heard about these utilities. And these utilities have been everything. So they've never had to worry about a power market. And now they're going to deregulate. Well, they're not really deregulated. They're open. It's an open access. Yeah. It's an open access. Where are the skills going to come from? Because they don't know what to anticipate. And this is the thing that we're saying. So we don't want to muddle through the process. And then with all these things, what happens is that because it doesn't work, because we didn't anticipate the issues, people say, well, it doesn't work. And then we fall back, like in Mexico, where everyone is going back towards the monolith, the vertically integrated utility. How do you guard against that?
Like a lot of the things we've been discussing today, I don't know that they're really easy answers, to this. The challenge I think with open access is, we see this in the United States, providing a system where independent power producers can quickly get their projects integrated onto the grid, can get fair prices for the electricity that they're selling. So if you don't have those sorts of basic features in place before you create open access, you're not going to attract the investments from the private sector to provide new generators. Yeah. So I guess I would go back to what I was saying before. To me, the strength would be to have to have people in the government who understand how the market needs to work and can either be regulating the current vertically integrated utilities, or they can provide the rules that are going to attract the private sector to merchant plants and independent power producers.
Yeah. So, Vidi, you've recently concluded a couple of first PPPs for transmission lines. What's your experience?
So firstly, it's exciting, right? So I'm listening to the conversation, and I think sometimes we overcomplicate things, right? A lot of these markets have done it before.
Yeah.
And so what we're trying to do as Africa 50, we call it a market first. It's a market first on the continent, but it's not a market first in Latin America, in Asia, right? So I think for us as Africans, it's really leveraging, and I think to me, South-South cooperation is critical. Understanding how it's been done in other markets, learning from their experiences and learning what not to do, and bringing this onto the continent. And that's exactly what we've done as Africa 50, working with Power Grid of India. They're one of the largest operators and managers of transmission grid and transmission lines in India and in the world, for that matter. And so being able to bring in their expertise and say, how do we work with the Kenyan government in executing on the first transmission line PPPs on the continent, right? And it's been a journey. So project development is not easy. We've gone out at risk to engage with the government, walk the journey with them to say, this makes sense. Just as we've seen the evolution and the transformation within power generation sector, the same thing is applicable to transmission infrastructure, right? We've seen a lot of power generation come on board. We've seen this in South Africa, we've seen it in Egypt, we've seen it in Senegal. But the issue is our governments haven't been able to invest into transmission infrastructure, right? The REAP program in South Africa, I think around 4 or 5, they couldn't actually allocate any of the wind assets because they didn't have sufficient transmission or grid connectivity. We haven't invested at all in these assets, so there's huge leakage along the way. So I think to us, it's really around where has it been done before, where we can see the success, and then bring this and adjust it and, to the nuances on the continent. But a large part of this is around, and I completely understand what Billy says, it's around capacity building, hand-holding, learning, capacitating our counterparts. To me, the role of government is not to be running these assets. The role of government is to create the enabling framework, right? And that's what we need to move away from as a continent. The other key thing is it's just the institutions, but it's political will. We've been able to do transactions. We've got 25 transactions. So I'm laughing, we've got 70-year-old institutions, 25-year-old. We're the newest kid on the block. We've been operating for 8 years. But within these 8 years, we've been able to do 25 projects across 28 countries, right? With very little capital, mind you. But what we have seen where we've been successful is the political will. The willingness to do the most basic things like licensing, right? That's sometimes one of the hurdles to getting projects done. And so that political will from our leaders, from government, is going to be critical to ensure execution of projects.
Yeah, I mean, you know about permitting and licensing here.
Yeah, I was going to jump in. I mean, I think one of the biggest problems we face in the United States right now is the risks that projects face. Getting the projects built on time, on budget. Usually the performance of the technology is not the question, but there are lots of delays getting the projects put into place. So I think this political will that you're mentioning and the desire to move the projects through to completion, when you have that kind of commitment and leadership, again, there was somebody on an earlier panel was talking about having the minister of energy or whoever kind of bless a project and make sure it had all the right approvals. That sort of thing is going to be really important to make sure that the private sector is excited and doesn't feel like it has, risk on the most basic level of getting the projects built. I mean, there's other risks, the markets and being able to sell power and make money, or the currency risks or things like that, but it's, at least they can get the project built on time.
Andrew, I don't want to usurp your role as interviewer, but I think there's an interesting term that you used, and I just...
It's a conversation.
It's a conversation,
Yeah.
Good. that I wanted to break down, and what I hear from a lot of our private sector leaders, which is why or when will we break down exactly what political will means? Because it's a great term, and it means a lot of things. And I think what I hear from businesses, both African and other, is, just breaking down the conundrum on, what political institutional entity would not want power for its people at an equitable and accessible price, would not want, an efficient education system or health system. I'm not trying to get political here, but I think the question is, once we can navigate and really understand what political will is, or what are the markers, you talked about your successful projects, then I think it might also make it easier for business to understand. So I think also we might be complicating our own, risk perception issues by complicating what this political will is. I'd love to know if you could pinpoint when political will is in the right direction, what does it look like?
Very, very good question. Political will for me is very simple. So if I look at South Africa and why they were successful with the renewable program is that they set up a PPP unit. So the frameworks were very clear. As an investor, I knew where to go, who to speak to, and what the regulatory framework looks like, very simply. In places where the regulatory framework might not be there, I need an accountable government official who I can go to and say, Mr. Minister, Mrs. Minister, Ms. PS, how do I go about this? We've just finished a transaction in the Gambia, small little country. It's something that we call asset recycling, right? Asset recycling has been done in Australia and other markets where we're saying to our governments, you don't have fiscal capacity to do a whole lot. You own assets that are de-risked, that the private sector can manage for you and operate, right? So sometimes you've got wonderful assets, but we don't have the budgets as governments to set aside to maintain them. The Minister of Finance was our counterpart. There were certain issues around licensing, as simple as licensing for a concession agreement. He was willing to get into the car, to go to the Minister of Transport and say, I need this. If he doesn't understand, he will call and say, I'm in the minister's office. What do you need, Africa 50? That to me is political will. The ability to call and do what's necessary to unblock the hurdles to get the project implemented. Because it's an opportunity cost for us.
Absolutely.
As investors, it's an opportunity cost for the country. I mean, I love what you say about who wouldn't want. But the blockages that we see where governments are spending $250 million paying for diesel fuel, when we could have hydropower or solar PV at cheaper costs, right? Sometimes they don't think it through. What we're arguing about is an IRR of 16% versus 15.5%. That half a percentage point is $250 million that you're paying every single year, which is a fiscal burden.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think one of the things you mentioned about having somebody to go to explain everything to you if the regulatory framework is not obvious, I mean, that's, to me, a really obvious problem that the private sector faces when they're moving into if you have new investors and you're trying to attract new capital and it's a new market, I mean, you can have a very proven technology, bread and butter projects in another jurisdiction. And when you try to move them to a new place, it's all they see is risk. They don't know how to navigate. And so providing that kind of institutional structure, which I think is what we're calling political will, to unlock those opportunities is exactly what's needed. And it sounds like that's what you guys are doing, which is great.
And it goes back to Sandra's point around the perceived risk versus the real risk, right? So it's some of this uncertainty and lack of information that then adds to the risk premium that governments have to pay for, which then goes down to the end user having to pay for it.
Yeah, I think it's also the point that in the last panel made that, I mean, myself, I'm also a recovering civil servant. And one of the things that when you're in government, there's so much data in government. It's unbelievable. Government collects data on everything. But we're just not good at giving it to investors, to researchers, who can then package it in a way that makes sense, And Sandra, for your organization, I think, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought that one of the reasons why the Global Compact was set up is to be able to bridge that gap between government and private sector, because we don't speak the same language. Government speaks something else, private sector, and they're sitting in the same room, speaking past each other. What, you know, there was a discussion at one of your panels day before yesterday, and the private sector was saying that, you know, we need to figure out what government is thinking. They need to give us clarity. What more can you guys do about that?
Absolutely, and let me complicate it further, because we try to bring the UN, government and private sector together to speak the same language. Yeah. So not easy. I'm a recovering private sector executive as well. Lots of, you know, but it's just interesting to see even around a framework which, you know, the Sustainable Development Goals designed in 2015. And the idea was that if the private sector was going to engage, they would come in from an investment perspective. So different from the MDGs, where perhaps it was towards the tail end, when the private sector was crowded in, when we realized, you know, success maybe wasn't at hand. But what we realized at this midpoint, we did the stock take of the SDGs last year and sort of, you know, brought out this dire statistic, only 15 or now 17% at hand. But part of that is, and when we speak to private sector, they say that, you know, there's a real opportunity to demonstrate the ROI on investing in the SDGs. And it's not always there, and it's not always clear. And this exists not only, you know, in more advanced economies, but also for developing emerging economies. So right, we speak different languages, but at the heart of it is the same problem. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. We want to bring, you know, clean, green energy to citizenry. We want people to have a functional health system. You want, you know, to promote lifelong learning. There's huge opportunities in climate investment. We heard that from, for example, the Africa Climate Summit. We heard COP all the time. But no, we're not speaking the same language. So if I was to say, you know, one thing would be, how do we then look at these investment or business opportunities and perhaps have clarity on, you know, one, what is the pathway to get there? You know, what are we looking for? What are the KPIs as we plan and design? But also, what is the ROI on these? And I think, for me, if we could solve that problem actually for the United Nations, it would be one of the biggest wins that we could have, because, you know, we've spent the last 2-3 days at the Global Africa Business Initiative talking about how Africa is truly the premier business, investment, and trade destination, but that Africa needs to come to the table to articulate that. And part of that is that I just feel that we haven't really put enough effort collectively to define, separate from the risk perception that hangs over the continent, what really is investable. You know, another practical example, we, you know, talked about the DRC, I think with debt or, you know, of about $10 billion, but the resources underneath the ground, $5 to $7 trillion. Yeah. So again, the question is, you know, what language do we need to collectively come together and speak to demonstrate that investing in the DRC, helping de-risk, change perception, is actually of immense value to DRC, to the African continent, and the world, and will address a lot of the energy security issues we have, some of the political stability issues we have, but most importantly, DRC has to be at the center of determining its own future. Yeah. So there's, you know, there's so many, you know, incidents where we can look and just say, look, it's a language thing, maybe it's a political will piece, but we're definitely not speaking the same language. Yeah. I mean, the UN is spending most of its time in DRC probably on peacekeeping, whereas we're very clear that from an energy security perspective and, you know, critical minerals perspective, DRC is the place to be.
I want to ask the three of you a question. So next year, governments have to reissue their national determined contributions. And I was asking during one of your meetings this week, how many of your private sector members have ever read their country's NDCs? None had read them. And this is what we were saying, that governments are writing checks that private sector will have to cash. So they say, we're going to reduce emissions by 30%. But where are these emissions that you're reducing? You know? And how does it impact your industrial policy? And for example, there's a shortage of 51 million basic housing units in Africa today. 51 million. It means that people are going to be living in slums There'll be no sanitation. You know, it's a crazy situation. But in order for you to build 51 million homes, that's cement, steel, glass, all these are emissions. Yet, in the NDCs, which are done by, I guess, by the Ministry of Environment, we're going to reduce emissions on a business as usual case. What do you see in your various sectors that can be done for private sector, banks, researchers, to help government think through NDC so they're relevant to industrialization, so that investors know which direction we're traveling? Is it renewables? Is it building? What is it? And you heard earlier that 13 of the 20 largest cities in the world will be in Africa by 2050. What needs to be done? Nanda?
Yeah. I think the first and one of the bits, we're working with an entity called the NDC Partnership to really bring private sector into those discussions on defining the NDCs. I mean, our first realization is that the NDC discussion should not only exist within the Ministry of Environment or wherever, it could be environment, climate, whatever it's called. I think you need to bring in Treasury or Finance, you need to bring in whoever does your national planning and development, so I think first the sort of cross-sectoral ministerial approach in government is really essential. I think secondly, just clarity on incentives. More incentives continue to go into fossil fuel exploration and others, then go into renewables. So private sector will say, fine, we are ready to come to the table and support the NDC process, but there's no clear incentives on it anyway. And then third is just the simple one about inclusion. And you're right, I mean, a number of our members, and indeed huge businesses even globally that work in energy and in renewables, are just not involved in the NDC discussion. Yeah. And I think it's symptomatic of where the private sector lies, particularly in a lot of large negotiations that are indeed government-led. I think we need to find a way to bring private sector to the table, not at the end of the discussion, not only being seen as a financier, but really a co-creator in these solutions. Because if we really are to be able to mobilize what is seen as the excess, underused, not well invested private capital in the world, we need to sort of front load the conversation so that the private sector can see value. Yeah. Otherwise, I just think again, it's to your question of language, but now for me, it's also a question of sequencing and when we want to engage.
William, it's a question you and I have talked about before, about the whole thing of CBAM, and here we are blindsided in the developing world with these border adjustment things.
Well, I think one thing that Sandra said that I think was key for me is, you kind of have the NDCs sitting off here as very high-level ambitions. The private sector over here. The thing in the middle is the policies, and the incentives that they're creating. CBAMs are one set of policies, and they've created a really interesting conversation. But as you and I were discussing, so CBAMs are when you tax imports coming into a country because the country exporting doesn't have an adequately aggressive climate policy. And in some ways what's happening is those are motivating those other countries to think about more ambitious policies, which is wonderful from a climate perspective. But there hasn't been any conversation, or there's been very little conversation with developing and emerging countries about how they should be represented in a CBAM in a fair and equitable way. Yeah. And not to go back to the story about capacity, but it does require capacity in these countries the private sector and the government to engage in a climate and trade discussion, which probably hasn't happened yet. So, I think the policies are the important parts to engage the private sector in particular. And this, climate and trade issue is something that I think the private sector and the governments both have to pay more attention to, because it's coming one way or the other.
Okay, I'll come back to you on that one. Safidi.
Difficult question.
Yeah.
And it's a difficult question because you're talking about 54 countries that need to come together to have a single voice so that they have a seat within these global conversations, right? Geopolitics are at play, right? So from where I'm sitting, people are talking about emissions controls. There are a handful of countries on the continent that are contributing to the emissions, right? You mentioned the figures, 3% emissions from the continent. But what's being forced down is the fact that it has to be a renewable energy play.
Yeah.
That's all well and good, but we're not going to be able to industrialize as a continent on solar. Let's be very clear.
Yeah.
We have got significant gas resources that we're not exploiting. And the pushback is, don't exploit gas resources. If we were to actually invest in gas, what are we doing? We're increasing emissions by 0.5% on the entire continent. That's getting rid of diesel generation. It's getting rid of 500,000 premature deaths of young children from using charcoal and biomass because people are not able to get clean cooking fuel. So those, to me, are some of the conversations that we need to have. Right now, Zambia doesn't have 12 hours of power. 80–90% of the country is run on hydropower. But because of climate impact, you know, their water levels are low. So from a hydrology perspective, so climate is a crisis for us as a continent. But we need to be realistic. We talk about, you know, I was very happy to hear Andrew's conversation around the just energy transition. The just is what we need to think about. And for some of us, it's not a just energy transition. It's actually access to energy, because we currently don't have access, right? And so I think these are some of the conversations that our leaders need to have collectively and have a seat at the table, or make sure that they can have these conversations.
I think it's even more complicated than that, because, you know, you heard earlier that Andy was saying how Nigeria has Africa has double its installed capacity for electricity in diesel generation.
Well, there you go.
And if you look at a place like Lagos, SE4All just recently did a study on diesel generation in Lagos, 20 gigawatts, all on the grid. I mean, these are customers that are on the grid, but they need grid reliance. The grid is 5 gigawatts. The installed diesel capacity is 20 gigawatts. So, and yet they're flaring gas 200 kilometers away in Port Harcourt. Why not bring that gas and substitute it for diesel? Which brings me to the other point. How many countries that are flaring gas in Africa actually have a gas master plan that will inform the investor? This is the direction of travel we want to go. This is what we're thinking. You know, as I keep telling my kids, I'm not a mind reader. If you have a problem with me, you better tell me what it is. So by the same token, you know, we can't expect the investment community to mind read. Last words. Where do we start?
I think this is a really rich area for further discussion. I mean, I was really, you know, your comments were dead on. I think, you know, there needs to be more of a voice of Africa in these debates that are happening in other places. And that's something I think it's a really important area to focus on.
Sabiti?
I think sort of sitting here for me, it's, you know, and what we're doing as Africa 50, we're focused on innovation, right? And it's institutions and what it is that you're doing, Andrew, to sort of say, how do we do things differently, right? We've reached a critical point from a climate perspective that we need to do things differently. It can't be business as usual. So where do we get innovation from? Energy efficiency, different technologies. Just as we've been able to leapfrog on the continent, I know it sounds trite, but from a telecoms perspective, even from a financial service sector perspective, what is it that we can do within the energy and climate space to be able to leapfrog as a continent?
Sandra?
I would say we're at, I think, a critical moment for the continent in terms of our resources, our people, what the future trajectory looks like. But at the same time, I think we have a lot of history and hindsight. And I just, you know, I'd call on everybody, you know, all the stakeholders, let's not make the mistakes of the past and really see what we can innovate around, what sorts of different configurations, policy, government, private sector, UN come together. You know, we've done it once, it didn't work out very well. Let's try and do it differently.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
right. Well, thanks to the panel for this very rich discussion. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and we will be sharp. We'll be back at 11:30. The restrooms are on the side. There's snacks and coffee downstairs. But please be back by 11:30 because we have two really rich conversations on energy justice. Thank you.
And yeah, we'll do it after. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, quickly? No. I think we're starting.
We're good.
Should we?
We're good.
Yeah, I think we're okay.
Okay. All right. Welcome back, everybody. Let's just jump right back in, and hopefully people will slowly come back. We're going to turn the lens a little bit locally now, focusing in the US. Here at EOL, one of our key roles is really to make sure that we highlight the importance of focusing, centering energy justice and environmental justice in the energy transition, and utilities play a key role on that, and we're going to discuss exactly that today, the role of utilities in advancing energy justice in the US. For that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Diana Hernandez, who is our Managing Director of Domestic Programs here at EOL and also professor at the Mailman School of Public Health. And then our panelist, Dr. Mark Toney, Executive Director of the Utility Reform Network, TURN. Bo Morton, Social Justice Program Officer at Con Edison. Suzanne Russo, Fellow and Director of the Environmental Justice Initiative at Resources for the Future. And Jane Roshan, Regulatory Analyst at the California PUC. Over to you, Diana.
All right. Well, first of all, I just want to acknowledge that it's Friday. Climate Week has been so intense. So thank you for those of you that are here. For those of you that are checking in remotely, we appreciate your attendance. And now we're really going to talk about what we've been focusing on the domestic side, on utilities as a way of understanding the structural determinants of energy insecurity. Energy insecurity, as some of you know, is defined as the inability to adequately meet household energy needs. And so much of that work has actually been focused on household income and or housing conditions, which we know are really important. But actually, when we start to interrogate utilities and the role of utilities and rates, then we also can start to unlock and unveil and connect to some of the other upstream determinants of this phenomenon. And so we have an exciting panel with folks that are working on the inside and on the outside, and will walk us through this. We're gonna kick this off with Dr. Mark Toney, who is here from the Utility Reform Network, and he will walk us through well, first of all, he has this very interesting way of identifying himself, and I will leave that to him. But also to initially talk about the intervenor compensation program in California and what that is doing to shape utilities and have them, kind of be more accountable, held more accountable. So, Dr. Mark Toney, please kick us off. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. I've always been taught to stand when you speak. So I'm Mark Toney. I'm an organizer by trade, a sociologist by discipline, and a troublemaker at heart. TURN, that's the organization I work for, the Utility Reform Network, believes that we can and should live in a society where power, broadband, and phone service are considered human rights for all families. TURN is committed to the cleanest energy at the lowest prices, or as I like to say, we want the most green for the least green. We need to prevent the cost of greening the grid from cutting off Black, brown, or any vulnerable communities because the monthly bills are just too doggone high. The goals of 100% for clean energy need to be met and linked with goals for 100% utility service, okay? Universal utility service. So skyrocketing bills cause extreme affordability crisis for California residents. In 5 years, Pacific Gas and Electric, the largest utility in California, the rates have doubled in 5 years. They're now 46 cents per kilowatt hour. The customer utility debt has increased by 500% in the same time period. 214,000 households were disconnected by PG&E, and 45,000 were never reconnected. Disconnections are a hidden driver of homelessness. The climate goals are undermined when the cost of running an appliance, we're talking about hot water heater, we're talking about electric stove, it now costs more. Your monthly bill would be more than if you stayed with natural gas. That's a problem. People don't like to be punished for doing the right thing for the environment. They just don't like it. So, TURN has been around about 50 years. I've been executive director for the past 17. So let me say a few words about the intervener compensation program, because I've been asked. So this is a program that was initiated by the California Public Utilities Commission in 1981. So it's a long-standing program. It was adopted by the legislature in 1985. And the way it works is if you're an organization like TURN, it reimburses attorney fees and expert witness fees at market rates when the organization makes a substantial contribution to the outcome of a proceeding, and you're representing ratepayers. We have about 24 organizations that participate, and the way it promotes equity is that it allows a wide range of environmental justice organizations, organizations that represent people who are medically disabled, racial justice organizations, organizations that represent small businesses to participate in the proceedings, to bring new evidence, new perspectives that cannot be brought internally from the CPUC staff. TURN is a staff of 24 attorneys, policy advocates, organizers who fight for the economic and equity interests of ratepayers at the California Public Utilities Commission, at the state legislature, in Sacramento, and in the media. We get a great deal of mainstream media coverage, print, television, radio. I would say about at least 20 interviews a month. And the main reason we can do this is because of intervener compensation. TURN intervenes in about 100 proceedings a year, and we earn from intervener compensation about an average of $4 to $6 million a year. So it's our largest single source of our budget. The thing I want to leave you with of what makes TURN impactful is not only do we know how to document problems, complain about problems, about shutoffs and skyrocketing bills, we are an organization that has solutions. We have solutions to limit rate increases by requiring utility companies to set limits on how much they spend, by requiring shareholders to cover the costs of overspending. We have proposals to generate external revenue sources to reduce rates. Climate Equity Trust, looking at federal funding, state income tax, and also alternative financing so that we can use lower cost public financing for transmission projects instead of very expensive utility private sector financing, because you cut out the shareholder investor profits. So I'm going to leave it at that for now, and I'll sit here for the rest of it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tony, for kicking us off that way. Now, Jane, no pressure, of course. Following up on Mark Tony, it might be a little bit of a challenge, but I know you're up to it. You are one of our own. You graduated last year in the SUMA program. Those of you that are in the Sustainability Management Program, shout outs to you. You were also a fellow at the DOE, and then you landed a job at the California Public Utilities Commission. And you are working on the inside to actually provide some oversight and guidance when rate cases, for instance, come to the regulatory body. So tell us a little bit more about what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, and what are some of the principles and issues that you all are balancing when you're looking at some of these issues from an energy justice perspective?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And two sides of the same coin, really, with Mark. So happy to be here with Turn, and very appreciative of Diana and all the others that have provided this space for us to talk about energy and justice. I work at the Public Advocate's Office within the California Public Utilities Commission. And I will preface by saying that, I'm not here representing my organization. So the thoughts that I'm sharing today are my own. But the Commission is a state agency that works with utilities to set energy rates, to oversee energy rates, as well as to drive the investments and decisions that make those costs behind what the energy rates are. And right now, electrification and decarbonization are the core of every conversation in energy regulation in California. The Commission is conducting so many different processes and proceedings to look at how we can achieve these goals of electrification and decarbonization while still maintaining a reliable and safe grid and managing the costs that come with it. So there are a lot of different ways that the Commission is looking at this. They're looking at kind of a distributed energy resources future and what that means in terms of investing in DER resources to achieve our goals. They're also looking at how utilities can have greater operational flexibility on the distribution grid. So how can we manage the demands that we have efficiently and strategically to reach these goals while kind of putting infrastructure in place that really allows us to do that in the most effective and efficient way. They're also looking at how we can achieve and maintain our resource adequacy goals. So as we retire gas-fired power plants and other fossil fuel sources, we have a new challenge of how we can keep energy supplied to people at all times, whenever it's needed. And so looking at how can we integrate batteries and renewable resources together is a new way of looking at those kind of reliability needs. At the Public Advocate's Office, where I work, we participate in almost all of the proceedings. So Mark said 100 proceedings at Turn. Because we're located within the Commission, we're participating in the span of proceedings happening at the Commission. And we're looking to support investments that provide cost effectiveness. So when an investment basically can provide the most benefit to ratepayers, we want to be able to support that. And so we're going through all these proceedings kind of in line with what the utilities and the Commission and the other stakeholders are looking at, but advocating and supporting for the most strategic, cost-effective solutions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jane. Now, Bo, we go back to the days that you were at WEACT, and very much you have a background in education, and you were leading their environmental health and education program, and you've since taken your talents over to the other side, Con Edison, which is the local utility here in New York City. And we were just on a panel the other day about promoting or advancing all kinds of justices at the utility. That seems like a real turn in direction. But you're there leading social impact programs. Tell us a little bit more about what you're doing and how you're advancing justice at the utility.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure no one was more surprised about the plot twist than I was. But hello, my name is Bo Morton. I'm the Social Justice Program Officer at Con Edison. My work has been in environmental education and environmental justice, specifically around community health and education. We act for environmental justice, and so now I am at corporate affairs within Con Edison, which is sort of a touch point for customers, for a lot of different stakeholders, as well as employees. And within that, strategic partnerships, which focuses on community partnerships and corporate giving. The company really, I think, really, fueled by not only the CLCPA, but really thinking about the impacts of climate change and the clean energy transition, to thinking more strategically about how investments are spent. And so over the past year or so, Con Edison has taken the time to transition into investing in 3 key areas. So one of those is clean energy and tech careers. One of those is climate change and environmental stewardship, and for myself, social justice. And so really, I found myself at a really amazing opportunity to be able to try and build a bridge between Con Edison as a utility and different community-based organizations, knowing that the solutions often are and should be community-led and community-focused. And so part of my work, and I'm really excited to have it focused around social justice, is not only to think critically about partnerships and investments when it comes to climate justice and environmental justice, but also when it comes to racial justice and economic justice. And really when we think about an issue like affordability, right, which is also a symptom of deeper issues. Something that I mentioned at the panel, which I really stand behind and I think is reflective of this portfolio, is that affordability is also intersectional. So when we think about social justice and we think about the impact on, your basement is flooded, your energy bill is high, your rent is high, maybe you live near a bus depot and so you have to deal with childhood asthma issues, right? All of these things that Con Edison as a utility should be thinking more about our customers holistically and who they are. And I think one of the really great opportunities of that Con Edison has and really is taking advantage of advancing justice is realizing that we have a really large customer base, right? We already have these relationships in place, and I think the company is really, there's a lot of work left to do, but I think is really taking at the helm of thinking strategically, not only around corporate philanthropy, but in other areas as well, on how we can be more engaged with customers and think strategically about equity, affordability, and justice.
And cumulative burdens, right? I mean, right, that utilities are often just one of many issues alongside health burdens and air pollution and all the other kinds of things that people are dealing with in communities. So thank you for elevating that at the utility. Now, Suzanne, you've had this really interesting kind of arc of a career as well. I first knew you when you were at Pecan Street doing research and kind of policy analysis. Now you're the director of an environmental justice initiative at Resources for the Future, and we heard from Billy Pizer earlier. Tell me a little bit more about kind of connecting the dots. You used to be at the New York City Housing and Preservation Department. So with a housing perspective, some agriculture, et cetera. Tell me more about how utilities can play a role in actually advancing justice as this kind of like connector to various sectors as well.
Yeah, that's a fun question, Diana. I'm going to answer it pretty briefly because I would also like to cede some of my time to you to talk a little bit more about your work. And I think what we mean by energy justice and injustice are really important to understanding the context for when we talk about the work that's happening and gaps. But so in short, we can't achieve energy justice in any of the sectors that Diana mentioned, housing, climate, agriculture, transportation, without the utilities' involvement, because all of that requires power. And if we're going to achieve our climate goals, we have to decarbonize our power sector. And if we're going to achieve our human rights goals and our social justice goals and our poverty alleviation goals, all of that requires access to affordable, healthy power. So utilities have to be a part of this. We have a nexus with utilities in this country where we have regulators that set some guardrails around how utilities are able to charge customers, what they can charge for, how they can earn a profit, how much profit they can earn, how they can compete or not compete with each other. And then we have customers who interact with those utilities. And then in some states, we have ways that customers can intervene in the regulatory proceedings, like in California. And in states like where I live in Texas, we don't have that. So we have a real mishmash, and it's very much driven at the state level right now about how we regulate the energy sector and therefore utilities. And so each utility therefore works across this matrix, across state lines, and then across within their communities about how they're able to serve customers and what kind of programs they're able to offer and how much money they can earn from that. So it's pretty complicated to think about what are national solutions to a just energy transition in the United States. That work really needs to first be answered locally. And the center of that is utilities working in partnerships with communities, like Bo was talking about, and I've talked about with some other utilities this week. You have to understand the problems that your customers are facing. And a lot of that is understanding these compounding inequities, these cumulative burdens that many people just aren't very informed about, and researchers have a really important role to play in illuminating how these inequities intersect to cause very specific outcomes within the utility electricity sector. And we can therefore, because we can unwind some of these cumulative burdens and cumulative impacts, then we can point to more targeted solutions. And so I think it is also very important to have researchers be a part of this conversation, particularly researchers like Diana, who are doing phenomenal community-based work to get at these very specific questions that we need great data that she is providing by going out and doing the hard work of partnering with households, partnering with communities, spending a lot of time, multiple years, to conduct research projects so that we can have real answers. And we do have a lot of those answers. We actually do know a lot of the solutions to the problems that we're talking about, but it's getting everybody in the room, communities, utilities, regulators, and researchers, to hash it out and to share knowledge. And then to have a way to share data back from the utility to us so we can evaluate how well things are working. But Diana, I spent a little longer than I meant to, but hopefully you can still spend a little time talking about your work, particularly the paper that you pointed the panelists to about policy insights for utilities for energy and security.
I am not prepared to answer questions. No, I like to ask questions. So I want to invite you all to definitely check out the CGEP website under Energy Opportunity Lab. We have been on the domestic side and on the global side as well, but publishing a number of papers that are starting to kind of lay foundations for our research, and on the domestic side, specifically on utility policies and practices. And I want to acknowledge Chandresa and Vivek and Martina and Abigail and a few other people that have been working with us on thinking about disconnection policies, on power outages and the restoration of power kind of post-outage, the duration and frequency of outages, and debt alleviation, and then the overall rates and and really kind of calling for rate differentiation and thinking about segmenting rate classes, which exist in some states, but not in others. And so we're basically providing insights on pathways forward to that. So thank you, Suzanne, for that. Also, we'll talk about this later, but we invite you to join us at the Energy Opportunity Experience downstairs, where we're walking you through what that feels like. I mean, I think for people that don't experience energy insecurity themselves, it's not always as obvious, but we want you to kind of have an experience, and we've set that up downstairs. I want to get back into the panel, but thanks, Suzanne, for ceding a little bit of your time for this. There are many wins, and I think, Mark, you were celebrating a few wins this week. Bo, I didn't add this to our line of questioning, but I'm just going to put it out there for you to kind of think about as Mark is responding on CLCPA, kind of creating a policy environment and a charge where utilities have to respond and be thinking about justice and taking affordability more seriously. But Mark, tell us a little bit about the many wins that you've kind of experienced more recently around affordability and disconnection reform in particular.
Thank you. Part of it is that TURN combines legal advocacy with grassroots community organizing, with communications, and with lobbying. And so with all of that, a few legislative wins, we were able to win passage of the Shutoff Protections Act, SB 698, which required the Public Utilities Commission to adopt goals to reduce utility disconnections and adopt metrics for bill affordability. The chair of the Senate Utilities Committee was the author of the bill, and he agreed to author the bill when grassroots leaders from his district, we brought them to visit on lobby day to his office. He was very impressed to see his district people, and he said yes. I will tell you that every year TURN sponsors a legislative champions reception in Sacramento, where we give credit and plaques to legislators who have passed TURN bills or have taken hard votes, because you have to know how to thank people. You're more impactful when you're known as thanking people as well as going after them. We do both. Another legislative win, we won $2 billion of state funding to reduce customer utility debt as a COVID relief measure. We got community action programs to be allies, public health departments. Actually, the utilities were okay with this. This was, this was more revenue for them, so they were supportive too. We just this week got a bill signed, SB 1142, that directs the CPUC to consider and to adopt additional protections against utility shutoffs, but also to help people get reconnected. The utilities in California and some other states play this game. Well, if you're a utility customer, before you get shut off, you have certain protections, but that once you get shut off, you're no longer a customer. They don't know who you are. You have to pay the whole thing to get turned back on. However, for the purposes of collecting the money you owe, you're still a customer. So we've given them a hard time. I want to do 3 quick regulatory wins. One is in implementing SB 698, we were able to win a CPUC ruling requiring utilities to reduce shutoffs by 50% by 2024 and adopted a series of metrics to track affordability. They adopted a pilot arrearage management plan that forgives 1/12 of past due bills for each month a low-income customer pays their current bill on time. So in 12 months, you could wipe out your whole back bill. up to $8,000, by the way, so we're talking about substantial. And the third is they adopted a pilot percentage of income payment plan that caps electric and gas bills for customers who are between 101 and 200% of federal poverty guidelines. $115 a month is what they pay, the maximum that they pay. And the maximum for those who have 0 to 100% of federal poverty, $38 a month for both electric and gas. This is what we think is the future, because true affordability does not depend on the cost of the commodity. Affordability depends on the ability of the household to pay.
All right, Bo. Tell us a little bit about enabling policy environments and what that has meant in particular for Con Edison in New York State. So just for background, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which passed in 2019, set the stage for focusing on disadvantaged communities receiving benefits from the clean energy transition and having caps around affordability and a suite of real benefits. And that's kind of changed the landscape in New York State. And because many of these policies are happening state by state, we continue to learn from California and New York as real leaders. So it's no surprise that, well, with the exception of DC, that we're really focusing on two of the leading states. But Bo, tell us a little bit more about what that has meant for centering kind of justice and a focus on disadvantaged communities, which was then adopted in Justice 40.
Yeah, so Con Edison is very much rallying around the CLCPA. I think part of that is looking for someone like me to come in on the inside and really lead some of the investments when it comes to community partnerships and investments in community-based solutions and also in relationships, right? I think one of the major challenges of doing this work at a utility is the historic partnerships, right? And being willing and engaged to get into delicate conversations and dive into the histories of what it means to be a customer, a reality of what it means to be a customer, and affordability. And I think the company is really trying to take the time to engage folks when it comes to customer outreach and when it comes to programs. And 45% of Con Edison's customers are considered like living in disadvantaged communities, right? Like that's a very large part of our customer base. We also created an EJ policy statement to also guide some of the operations and really connecting affordability to customer experience when it comes to grid reliability, to operations, and really everything that we do. And so a lot of that work is continuing. There are a lot of programs that exist. There are a lot of folks who need to be enrolled in programs, who need to be engaged when it comes to community outreach as well. And I think one of the bigger wins that I've had recently is an RFP that has been created focusing on climate risk and vulnerability from our strategic planning department. At the intersection of community needs and understanding the real landscape of affordability, not only when it comes to energy bill, but when it comes to climate impacts, and really putting the solutions that are in community hands, trying to put some steam behind that when it comes to, pun intended, when it comes to our support at Con Edison. So I think, even from personal experience coming into a major utility from an environmental justice group, I've seen a lot of folks who actually are, willing and wanting to be engaged in the work across, the company. as well. So I think that's, when we think about utilities, that's a really great start. And I think there are a lot of the bones that are here. And it's going to take a lot of work and effort from the inside and outside to move forward. But the company, I think, really standing behind the CLCPA and wanting to engage with various stakeholders around the policy has been key.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Suzanne, we know that data is a part of justice, right? Because transparency and being able to actually document issues is a part of how we understand the real landscape and how things are on the ground. When you were doing a lot more research, you were kind of an advocate for data and metrics. Tell us a little bit more about how utilities aren't always, what their role in making data accessible for the purposes of tracking and moving justice along should be or is.
Yeah. Yeah, data. I love talking about data. But one thing I want to point out when we talk about metrics, for which we obviously need data for, is I think it was in your paper, Diana, you called for, we need to establish a common metric for how we evaluate the efficacy of equity approaches at utilities. We need an equity impact metric that's common. And we need an agreement from regulators and utilities about what data is needed to evaluate that equity impact metric, and that data is going to be available to researchers and to the public. So I think just at a very simple level, that should be the #1 goal, is an agreed upon metric for how we evaluate equity, and that the data is going to be available to do that. And the problem is the data is not available right now broadly from utilities, but that's not because of a lack of will. It's not because utilities are intentionally being obstructionist. It's because we generally lack a regulatory framework around an individual's data. Utilities have a lot of personally identifiable information, sensitive data about households. There's no clear guidance from regulators about whether or not data on how much electricity you use could be considered sensitive information. And so until regulators actually step to the plate on this one, which asking an energy regulator to come up with novel data regulation standards and frameworks is really difficult. But arguably, the energy industry and utilities are the ones at the forefront of why this is important to solve this data access issue broadly. And the utility framework itself is actually a really applicable one to thinking about managing data. I think data is a utility functionally in our society, right? It's a commodity and an asset. It has value. We need it. We need access to it, and we generate it in our daily lives. And so you can actually take the electric utility framework and the regulations surrounding that and apply it to household data, and you have a pretty good solution. So we need some regulations because we have got to start getting access to all the data that utilities have so that we do have this transparency and we do have accountability to document injustices, but so that we can also evaluate what's working and what isn't as we go. I helped organize an energy justice workshop at Howard University yesterday in DC, and we had a number of government representatives there. Across DOE and EPA, the common theme kept emerging that these civil servants feel like they're having to build the plane while flying it when it comes to energy justice and environmental justice. And to be able to actually provide some value on like what's the shape of the plane that you're building and is it going to get you where you want to go, we have to have more access to data.
So we have less than 2 minutes. So Jane, I'm going to give you the last word on this. Tell me a little bit more about why it is that utilities have some challenges in being justice actors in earnest.
Yeah, so I'll come at that from a regulatory standpoint, and I'd love to answer this question by piggybacking off what Suzanne was saying, by describing a pipeline for equity and energy regulation. So bear with me. It starts with a focus on electrification, right, as I mentioned. From there, you need to enhance your grid investments to allow for the electrification to happen. Grid investments lead to system planning. And the act of system planning leads to, unfortunately, imperfect energy demand forecasting and the voice of large customers participating in that. which means that the inequities of the past become embedded in the future. That load forecasting leads to a need for equitable opportunity, which gives us the ability to implement democratic and bottom-up participation in that planning process. And so, as all this development in policy and infrastructure is happening around electrification, I do see an opportunity to patch together a process that gives communities the ability to integrate their energy needs and their energy goals into the system. An ability for communities to achieve energy solutions that provide wealth-generating opportunity. But right now, when we're looking at load forecasting that tells us where demand will be so that we can plan effectively, there are certain voices that are kind of controlling that narrative. And I just want to give a few, just one quick example. The California Independent System Operator is saying that we need about 7 to 8 gigawatts of renewable resources added to the grid every year for the next 10 years to meet load through renewable resources. Data centers in PG&E's service territory alone are saying that they need 3.5 gigawatts of resources by 2029. So you can see the kind of disproportionate impacts that certain customers have on resource capacity allocations. And the other major issue with that I'll just say quickly is that the energy justice implications do not show up in load forecasts, right? We have certain voices dominating the narrative, but we also have an underrepresentation of communities in where load will be. If you have underconsumption in certain areas, and that has been a historical problem, that will continue into the future through our load forecast if it's not addressed directly. So areas that are, energy burdened households or communities that are energy insecure that don't consume enough energy to provide a quality standard of living, those issues will show up in our grid investments, and those communities won't be afforded to consume the energy that they should be able to. So it's important that we spend reasonably on utility infrastructure, and that's very critical to maintaining system reliability and resiliency. However, we also can't have energy-burdened communities and energy-impoverished communities subsidizing what I'm calling the modern industrialization of electricity. So as Suzanne was saying, community voices and data showing up in the system planning process is super integral to realizing this equitable investment in the future. And there's a lot of ways that we can do this. The data is there. It's just a matter of kind of patching all the pieces together and making the process happen.
And with that, join me in thanking this really wonderful panel. We, of course, wish we had more time, but the conversation will continue now with Dr. Tony Reams. Thank you so much, panel.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, panel, for this very rich conversation on the role of utilities and by extension, regulators and legislators on centering justice in the operations of utilities. Like Diana mentioned, we're going to expand a little bit on this topic, on the ways that energy equity is being advanced with Dr. Tony Reams, the Tishman Professor of Environmental Justice at the University of Michigan School of Environment and Sustainability, and now also a visiting professor here at CEGEP. Over to you, Diana and Tony.
Switching gears. So obviously we're running a little bit behind schedule, but I hope that you all will stick around as this is bound to be an amazing conversation with my good friend, Dr. Tony Reams. I admire Tony so much, and we could go through like the whole bio, but there are few people in this world that I respect more, really, as someone who has been so instrumental in the scholarship and in the actual practice. Tony was recently at the Department of Energy leading the path to energy justice with what was the inaugural office, right? You were renamed, but you were the Principal Deputy Director of State and Community Energy Programs and the Deputy Director of Energy Justice at the Department of Energy. and now have resumed your scholarly role and taken on a new role as the director of the clinic, sustainability clinic in Detroit. So we're going to talk about all of that, with my good friend. So you have this interesting background as an engineer. You have a PhD in public administration. You have a military background. Tell us how you got to the place where you are doing energy justice work.
Well, thank you so much, Diana, for the opportunity to be here. Thank you all for being here today. Before I get started, I want to say that today is a very special day. Not only has Diana planned this amazing event, but she did it on her birthday. So yeah, I just wanted to pause and make sure you get recognized on your special day, because if you had not been born, I don't know if we would be talking about energy and security the way we do. And so again, but the respect is mutual for my friend. We've been at this about 10 years now. And so a decade of knowing each other and working in this space together to really do meaningful and impactful scholarship that communities can use to advocate for themselves. And so thank you for being in this journey with me. Thank you for bringing up, my background. So I was talking to some of the students at Columbia yesterday. I'm not an energy technologist. And so energy was not, I did not expect to be in energy. But my upbringing in what I consider one of the quintessential environmental justice communities in rural South Carolina, a community with the state's largest landfill and the state's largest maximum security prison, primarily African American. Most of the politicians are not African American. And so seeing what happens to communities when the people that live there lack the political capacity or political power to push back on environmental injustices. And so I do think that kind of upbringing, and once I learned about environmental justice, thinking about how everything I do as an engineer or now as a professor can be used to advance justice, like you heard on the panel right before us. But I often tell people how I got into energy was listening to stories. And so I did a mixed methods PhD, quantitative, qualitative, but it was the qualitative stories, talking to people during the economic recession about the role that energy cost, energy access, and the hope for clean energy transition meant to their lives. And so you heard on the last panel, it's pretty brass tacks, right? If you can't keep your house cool, if you can't keep your house warm, if your neighbors are being shut off and you have to store their groceries or run an extension cord, then you can't even think about this opportunity that we have when it comes to clean energy. And so thinking about it from a policy perspective, but really what it means for energy to intersect with people and communities is what got me into this space.
So I'm a sucker for stories. Can you just give us one story that has stayed with you and that kind of guides your work?
Yeah, so I talked to a lot of elders in Kansas City, Missouri, where I was at the time. And I was talking to them about the potential in the Stimulus Act when President Obama was in office, and really I was interested in rain gardens and stormwater flooding reduction. But again, people kept talking about energy. And so one woman, told me when she sees a utility truck, her heart rate goes up. And I was like, why does it impact you that way? And she said, even if I paid my bills, and they were going to shut off a neighbor, that still had an impact on me because, again, I'm storing their groceries, I'm running an extension cord, their kids are coming over to my house at night to take a shower or do their homework. And so it really highlighted, we think about kilowatt hours or we think about the infrastructure, but it's really the community aspect of, your energy is also my energy, right? And so I think, understanding that and then how technology and policy and design and implementation can actually make, lives better for people who are struggling to, like I said, just keep the lights on.
Mm-hmm. There's such an interdependence, right?
Yes.
And oftentimes, you know, you can make this conversation purely technical, but when you like kind of start to prioritize the vantage point of communities and households and individuals, you see it differently. So you've had the kind of unique experience of being a scholar, doing really foundational work in this space, your light bulb study, the study on the donut the donut hole around people who are kind of outside of the ecosystem of support and benefits. That and many other studies and work, you brought all of that to your work at the DOE. Tell me more about that translation to policy and practice and what that meant to be like a researcher fundamentally in that space.
Yes, I was super naive when I went into the federal government. And I see Haley there. We've had some good conversations. You know, I really thought like, oh, day one, I'm going to show up. You know, I got this political appointment. People, you know, because I was an officer in the Army, so you get some respect with, you know, your officer rank. And so I assumed that I would get, you know, this immediate respect and say like, this is how we're going to change the weatherization assistance program. Let's do it. Like I say, very naive. That was not the case. Because these are long-standing programs, you know, so some of the flexibility that we had coming into a new administration is that you do have some flexible dollars to try out, you know, some unique programs, right? And Congress gave us resources for some new programs, you know, like the local government energy program I was talking about a little earlier. And so it was kind of taking, you know, really simple applied research, like Diana mentioned, the light bulb study, which was a study that came about because I was listening to an NPR study, a story about how drugstores were charging different prices for the same medication in poor communities versus wealthy communities. And so me and my lab, we were talking and I was like, is this also happening in energy space? And something as simple as a light bulb, which is the lowest hanging fruit to be able to reduce your energy consumption, you know, is it available in all communities? And what does the price or affordability look like? And we found that LED light bulbs were half as available in poor communities as they were in wealthy communities, and they were twice the price if they were available. And so, you know, how can someone, because we were looking at communities with 40% poverty, you know, you go into a store, you may or may not see a light bulb, a LED bulb, but if you do, it's twice the incandescent bulb. You know, you're going to buy the incandescent bulb that's going to cost you more energy because you don't have time to do the calculation that, you know, our economist friends like to do on, oh, the payback period. And so it was kind of taking those simple approaches into government to think through, you know, we're trying to transition this, you know, 4-decade research and development agency, the largest, you know, research and development agency after the military and the federal government, to think about equity and justice in a way that they hadn't in the previous administration. And 4 years doesn't seem like a long time, but 4 years is a really long time when you have to respond to the policies of the, you know, the White House. And so a lot of the colleagues at DOE were not ready to pick up equity and justice immediately. And then, you know, most of the people that did it in the Obama era were gone. And so we spent a lot of time, a good colleague of ours, Shalonda Baker, both, you know, all of us professors, just going around and doing presentations about what is energy justice and why does it matter here at the Department of Energy. Luckily, we had the Justice 40 initiative that President Biden signed in the first week of his administration. But again, it was an initiative. It wasn't a policy. It was a directive, but it didn't have dollars attached to it. And so it's really learning how the federal government works when either it's a congressional mandate, it's an executive order from the president, or it's like a secretarial order. And all of those have different ways to implement. And so we had to learn that very quickly in like the first 6 months.
Yeah, it's like the kind of hard work of both socializing a concept and operationalizing it all at once. So a big deal. You're actually back in academia now. You're running a sustainability clinic in Detroit. So you have an academic hat. You now have federal government under your belt. And now you're doing work to translate a lot of that impact now to communities and the local community in Detroit. Tell us a little bit more about what that is and what the goals are there.
Yes, I'll give you a shout out on one of your papers that was super impactful to me. It's your Sacrifice Along the Continuum, a call for energy justice. And you did a case study on Detroit. What was it, 2015? So that might have been before we actually met. But showed up in Detroit in 2014, was really trying to learn what the energy justice landscape was like. And Jamal and I were texting during the last panel. You mentioned New York and California were leading the way, but you left out the Midwest. But amazing things are happening in the Midwest. But yeah, Detroit is an amazing place. Ingenuity, grit, not just in the manufacturing and auto industry, but it's also in this community aspect. The fight against utilities. Where's Bo? Is he still here? No offense to utilities. But, like there was a group called Work For Me DTE. DTE is our major investor-owned utility company. And that group, what they did was work with community members to teach them about the regulatory process. Now, how many people have been to a Public Service Commission meeting, intervened? Yeah, not a lot, right? I mean, and that's not something a typical person can find time to do in their lives. The Public Service Commission rarely had meetings in Detroit. They often had them in the suburbs, which they considered like having them in Detroit. But they asked for them to actually come to the city of Detroit and have a Public Service Commission meeting. Hundreds of people from the community went to the meeting. Some did public comment. Others that were not comfortable doing public comment made signs. Others were outside the meeting teaching members about an integrated resource plan. Just all these activities. And so when I had the opportunity to come back after DOE, I told my dean I wanted to do something that continue to work in the community. And so we started this sustainability clinic, kind of modeled after the law schools. To really support communities in their sustainability and climate action efforts. And so we have funding from Kresge Foundation and some other donors to help community groups apply for grants, help them think through community planning, resilience planning, connecting different nonprofits within the city that are trying to do the same thing, and then getting students out of Ann Arbor into Detroit so they understand what it really means to work in an urban setting. Because even though Ann Arbor and Detroit are about 45 minutes away from each other, they're still worlds apart. And so using this clinic to bring those worlds together.
You very recently wrote this basically call for a national energy poverty strategy. And in that, you write, and I'm going to quote, the unprecedented funding levels available for home energy improvement present a pivotal moment to address the cumulative burdens faced by energy insecure communities. Against this backdrop, we introduce a national framework to guide target investments and establish a foundation for treating the underlying conditions of household energy poverty. Tell us a little bit more about what that looks like and what is it going to take to actually make that happen?
Yeah, so the office that I was initially in when I got to DOE is an office that's almost as old as the department. So DOE was established in 1977. The Office of Minority Economic Impact was established in 1978. Now, how many people knew there was an office in the Department of Energy that focused on the relationship between minority communities and energy? I had no idea either. But it was, this little known office that was primarily focusing on civil rights and equal employment opportunity when we got there. But it had an extraordinary mandate. So in this congressional mandate from 1978, it had a research mandate to study the relationship between race, class, and energy. And that office had never been, that action had never been established. And so my first task was to create a brand new office called the Office of Energy Justice Policy and Analysis to do that and hire about 24 folks to kind of carry out both energy justice policy work, so doing all of that socializing that I talked about, but then also doing real hard research on metrics and some of the other things that we've talked about. And in that, I was like, we don't have a way, like there's no unified way to talk about energy poverty, not just in DOE, but across the government. So we have two large federal low-income energy programs, the Weatherization Assistance Program, which has been around since '76, and the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, which has been around since the '80s. One is in DOE, and one is in HHS. They both are viewed as like social service programs. And so I had conversations with the secretary about how do we make this really look like energy programs, right? You know, not necessarily welfare, but like an actual part of our energy decarbonization conversation. And so the energy poverty framework was a way for us to understand how we measure this, like how many people are suffering, you know, from energy insecurity, a lack of energy efficiency in their homes, a lack of access to reliable energy, and begin to come up with the metrics to be under this framework, all the programs across the federal government. So it's not just DOE and HHS, there's also a rural energy program in USDA. There's also energy programs for Indian reservations in BIA, you know, and so again, it was trying to create a national approach to energy poverty, and so I'm excited that the team is able to continue that, because there are a lot of things that, you know, you get started, and you need people to stay behind to continue to do that work. So the poverty strategy is one of those.
Yeah, just making sure. I mean, there's so much investment, right? That's the premise of the strategy. And like, how do we measure progress? How do we make sure that we're also like kind of making real inroads where we need it? And we can't do that. Like, what gets measured gets monitored. Also, that's where you have the impact. So Tony, I said there are very few people that I trust more, that I respect more, but also actually that I trust more with thinking about energy justice and what's necessary. Like, where do we move the dial? A lot of your work has been on establishing, you know, disparities in heating energy use intensity and like all of these different like kind of indicators. But if you had a magic wand and you said, today, this is what's absolutely necessary to like make real strides toward energy justice, what would you say? What is that?
Yeah. So like you said, I've spent the last decade really trying to visualize, identify disparities. Again, you know, these are things that communities have been telling us for years, right? Without the data, without the visualization, you know, groups that advocate like Turn, you know, being out here saying like, look, these are the issues. I think now we've identified the disparities. We have the solutions. They may be agnostic of the disparities, but we're still missing that connecting piece, which I think is energy democracy, right? So another term, but I think we can all understand democracy and how we democratize our energy space, both production, consumption, waste management. How do we put people back into these energy conversations, right? I heard wealth generation mentioned on the last panel. This unprecedented opportunity that we're in with resources flowing from both the public and private sector, philanthropy is trying to figure out how to throw money into this. Communities need to be able to be engaged, not just recipients of, you know, rebates but like really engaged in the decision making that happens. So we're creating an energy system that is definitely designed for the people and by the people. Excellent.
Tony, thank you so much. And as we kind of draw to a close, I also want to invite you all to stay around or take a little break, whatever, go walk around and then come back. We actually are having this kind of community-facing Climate Week event called Power Uptown, and we've done so much to promote that. Hopefully we'll have kind of much better attendance, but it was also like an open invitation for us to be talking with our communities about these issues, an invitation to be with us. And so that is a step in democratizing energy, because folks have to actually be in the room and at the table. So thank you all for joining us today at our second annual Energy Opportunity Forum. And make your way downstairs. As you do, please check out our Energy Opportunity Experience. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you, Tony and Diana, and thanks for paving the way so more of us can build on advancing energy equity. As we mentioned earlier, the Energy Opportunity Lab was established 2 years ago by the generous support of the Bedari Collective. So I would just like to invite Beth Colleton to give us closing remarks, the president of the Bedari Collective. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone, and I'll be really quick because I know we're running late. This was a great set of conversations, obviously, about unlocking progress and the potential through energy access. And the need's massive. We heard that, absolutely, but so is the opportunity. So I think, again, the inspiration we heard from people was just so important. And this week, so important, forums like this are so important, and the partnerships that you heard talked about today are what's really getting things moving and moving at scale. And what's important is it's not just about the smarts you heard on the stage, it's about how you take this action down to the ground, because thought leadership's great, but if it doesn't hit people, where they are, it really doesn't matter. And as you also heard, the challenges today are super complex, and you can't solve them in one-off. I mean, I've been to a lot of events here in Climate Week where someone's like, I've got a technology, or it's just about policy. It really is systemic change. I think in this forum, these conversations more than anywhere, you heard so deeply about the interdependencies. So it really is a systematic approach with research, with financing, with market developments, education policy, all working together to drive things forward. But we've got to have an eye on the prize of what we're actually working towards. With the ideas, it's really a regenerative future for all. All this week you hear net zero, net zero. Net zero is really gross zero, because if you're not factoring in how it impacts people in other adjacent ways or how it affects other nature, it's like we're not getting to where we really need to go. So we need to go beyond this concept of net zero to regenerative and understand we need to replenish our natural, our financial, our social, and our human capital. So it's really about not just unlocking values around education, around livelihood, about markets, but also do it with values. Inclusion, equity, representation, and advancement forward. Because it's easy to look at this as if it's a technical problem and go heads down and think it's about science or finance or what regulation. But at the core of this, and when we formed this lab, it's like it has to be human at its center. So I think just the closing thing I would say is, as we do this, our motivation is really going to be about how we uplift people, uplift communities, and unleash more potential, more possibility, and more progress for people. So thank you everyone who put this together and everyone who participated. So have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Beth. We spoke so much about the community, and I would like to remind you all that we have a community-focused event today at 5 p.m. So if you're around, please join us for that. And on that note, thank you so much for coming, and please visit the Energy Opportunity exhibit downstairs. Thank you. Have a good weekend.